We will call the meeting to order. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Welcome to the first meeting of the Executive Committee. The Mayor will be with us shortly. He is otherwise engaged and asked that we continue in his absence. You can watch on YouTube this meeting at Toronto City Council Live, or follow the meeting on your computer or tablet or on a smartphone at toronto.ca. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If so, please indicate the item number and the nature of the interest. Seeing none. Do we have minutes from the last meeting? No, this is because it's the first meeting. Councillor Crawford, do you have added business?
Yes, I do. Yeah, it's been circulated on paper.
All right, may I have a motion to add this to the agenda? Moved by Councillor Ainsley. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried. We have 9 items on the agenda, and so let me know if you wish to hold the items as we work through this. We have so item number 1, implementing the Housing Now initiative. We have 1 or 2 deputants on this item. So we are going to hold. All those in favor? No, we're not going to do that. Item number 2, Toronto Parking Authority governance. Moved by Councillor Ainsley. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Item number 3, we have a deputant, and that is on enhanced authorities of the Integrity Commissioner as a result of Bill 68. Item number 4, Real Estate Consultations, Environment and Energy Division, request from the Board of Directors of Create TO. Moved by Councillor Thompson. The recommendations, all those in favor, opposed, that's carried. Item number 5, appointment of CEO, Create TO. Did we get purple paper on that, or? Yeah? Okay, I haven't. Does someone want to move that? All those in, moved by Councillor Thompson, all those in favor, opposed, that's carried. Records Retention Schedule Amendment, Board of Governors of Exhibition Place. Moved by Councillor Ainsley. All in favor, opposed, that's carried. Item 1.7, Psychologist Benefits, Emergency Services Management, Non-Union Benefits. Moved by Councillor Nunziata. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried. That would be item, number 8 is Multi-Year Debenture and Temporary Borrowing Authority, 2019 to 2022. Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried. And the new item, changing the legal name of Civic Theatres Toronto to TO Live. Have members had a chance to review Councillor Crawford's item? Yes? Is Councillor Crawford's prepared to move it if nobody wants to hold it? Okay. All those in favor, opposed, that's carried. All right. I will move also that because of the voluminous number of deputants on item number 1 particularly, that the length of public presentations be limited to 3 minutes. All right? Any discussion on that? Pardon? All those in favor? All right. All those in favor? So can I see hands on this one, please? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Opposed? That carries.
If you can record a vote, you have to call the names.
No, he didn't ask for. Did you want recorded, Councillor Thompson? No, fine. Thank you very much. All right. So we're going to go to item 1, implementing the Housing Now initiative. We have speakers. So welcome everybody to all the deputants. Each person will have.
We have a presentation.
Oh, do we have a presentation? Do we want a presentation? Yes? Yeah? All right. Staff have a presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of committee. Thank you for this opportunity just to highlight some key aspects of the Housing Now initiative and the report that's before you today. And I know in the interest of time, I won't speak in detail to the slides, but before I start, I do want to thank and recognize a number of staff across multiple program areas that have come together, worked collaboratively together in order to make this initiative and this report possible, starting with staff from the Affordable Housing Office, from Planning, Creatio, Real Estate, Legal, Shelter Support and Housing, Finance, Building, Engineering and Construction, and I hope I haven't missed anyone, but it really has been a collaborative city effort. So you'll recall that in December, Council approved the Housing Now initiative to scale up the city's efforts to increase the supply of affordable housing by leveraging 11 city surplus properties to create affordable housing across mixed income, transit-oriented, complete communities. So the report before you today presents an action plan that will enable us to move forward and roll out this important initiative. And you'll also recall that in December, Council approved a number of principles to help guide this initiative forward. Those principles focus on trying to derive the highest possible public benefit from the sites, optimizing development with a mix of unit types and sizes, creating affordability across a diverse range of income levels, addressing and appropriately accommodating any existing city uses or operations, prioritizing the public retention of these lands, and a strong commitment to public consultation and engagement in the planning and development of the properties. So I'm now going to quickly walk you through the action plan, and we're going to start by quickly reviewing the recommended affordable housing program for the sites. So in total, the development across all the sites will generate approximately 10,000 new residential homes. 2/3 of those homes are going to be purpose-built rental, and at least half of those purpose-built rentals will be affordable rental. And by affordable, I mean that the average rent will not exceed 80% of average market rent, and that is as determined by CMHC each year. And at least 10% of the units will be rented at 40% of average market. Deeper affordability can also be achieved by leveraging the city's housing allowance, rent subs, and other housing benefits. There's going to be a range of units that are going to be required from 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms plus. At least 20% of units will be accessible. As I mentioned, the focus is going to be on retaining the lands through long-term leases. Projects are going to be required to meet Toronto's green standards. All of the affordable housing components for any of the developments will be prioritized within the development schedule, with affordable housing being spread throughout the development. And this report does recommend that the city use and approve its open door incentives in order to help support the reaching of our affordable housing targets across these sites. In terms of delivery, each of the sites is going to go through a stage gate process, and that's to ensure proper oversight and accountability, starting with a due diligence review, the development of a business case for each of the properties, and those business cases, it's recommended be approved by the Deputy City Manager, the CFO and Treasurer, and the Creatio Board. We're then going to move, once those business cases are finalized, move to the market offering. That market offering will also include the evaluation of all the bids that come in and the awarding and negotiating of the contract. The final stage, of course, is going to be construction and delivery, and then to ensure an expedited process throughout, the report is recommending that we delegate certain real estate decisions for approval by senior management. To manage and coordinate the planning and implementation of the program, we will be establishing, if the report is approved, a housing secretariat. That'll be headed up by an executive director supported by a dedicated team of staff across multiple areas, planning, legal, creatio, and SSHA. All the staff positions will be temporary in nature for about 4 years, and we'll reassess as we move forward. In terms of the financials, the report does recommend an allocation of $20 million from the City Building Reserve Fund, and that's to fund the due diligence work that needs to be done so that we can ready those properties for market. That due diligence work and this initial $20 million will also fund the temporary positions I mentioned, as well as establishing a nonprofit housing capacity fund, and that's to help the nonprofits' ability to participate on this initiative, the Housing Now program. As I mentioned, to support the development of 3,700 affordable rentals, we are recommending the city's open door incentives. That represents a total investment of $280 million over the 99-year affordability period. And then any additional operating or transactional costs that might occur are going to be considered through future budgets, with the costs offset by the revenues that are generated through the land transactions. And of course, we will be leveraging to the full extent possible any federal funding or financing programs that are available largely through the National Housing Strategy. So here you have the 11 sites. You'll see they're scattered across the transit corridors. Combined, those 11 sites represent over 40 acres of land, the development of which generates $4.2 billion in construction activity and over 13,000 person-years of employment. In terms of next steps, they span over a number of years. In 2019, business cases will be well underway. They should be completed by 2020. We anticipate 4 sites going to market in 2019 and the remaining 7 in 2020. By 2021, construction will be underway, and completion and occupancy is targeted between 2022 and 2024. Now, you have to keep in mind that Housing Now is only one of the programs and initiatives that allows us as a city to scale up our efforts to bring on new affordable housing to the market. Staff are currently in the process of developing a new housing opportunities plan or housing plan. Our current plan expires this year, and for 2020 to 2030, we'll be bringing forward a report with our full recommendations to this council in the fall. The plan is going to be supported by extensive market research and extensive consultations with stakeholders and the public. And the plan will recommend actions on how to address the housing needs and how to establish targets across the full spectrum of housing. So right from shelters to long-term care to supportable housing to lower and mid-range housing options. So the updated housing plan is going to leverage a number of programs and approaches in order to incentivize the development of affordable housing to help us achieve our housing targets. I'm not going to go through them all. They are listed on this slide, but keep in mind that as we continue to finalize our plan and we continue with our consultations with stakeholders, other ideas might come forward in terms of how we might be able to spur the development of affordable housing. So I'll just end it there in case there's any questions.
Thank you. We'll hold questions until we finish hearing from the deputants. Is that all right? We're going to go to the deputants, but first, Councillor Thompson is moving that speakers who have not pre-registered be allowed to register to speak until 10:30, after which no further registration is allowed and the speakers list will be closed. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. So we're going to go to the speakers list right now. So 3 minutes per person. If you haven't been here before, come up when your name is called. You'll have 3 minutes, and then members will have the opportunity to ask you questions. Unfortunately, deputants aren't allowed to ask the committee members questions. And then we'll work through the list that way. After that, we'll take it in committee. We'll ask questions of staff, and then we'll deliberate on the item and make recommendations. So the first speaker I'm going to call is number 20, Amy Slotek. I understand she has a baby, and a beautiful baby. And she, because of that, we're going to let her speak first. Thank you for coming.
Indulgence. And if you don't mind, I'm going to stand. Anyone who's a parent knows that they don't sit still for long, so I appreciate it. And if I can't hear, please let me know in the back. So yes, thank you very much. My name is Amy Slotek. I am a lawyer with Legal Aid Ontario. I run a program focused entirely on providing legal support to Torontonians who are homeless and facing mental health addictions and disabilities. The views, though, that I express today are entirely my own and not Legal Aid Ontario's. In fact, I'm actually on maternity leave, but I've been compelled to bring my 10-month-old child here today because I'm so concerned about the crisis that is confronting the city when it comes to homelessness. So, as I mentioned, I provide representation to homeless clients in provincial courts who are facing charges in relation to their homelessness. These are individuals who are being charged for sleeping on the street when they can't find a bed at our at-capacity shelters. These are individuals who are asking for help from passerbys. And these are individuals who are setting up tents in tent cities when they have nowhere else to go. And let me tell you, when the city wants to prosecute and criminalize homeless people, it really mobilizes some resources. My experience is that when it comes to that, we have resources, we can coordinate an offense, and we can coordinate police. So I am here actually to lend my voice to the hundreds of advocates and thousands of Torontonians who believe that the lives of all Torontonians matter, who are calling on the mayor to show, welcome mayor, who are calling on the mayor to show leadership and to declare this crisis for what it is. This is an emergency that has reached such a critical level that it requires a coordinated response from all levels of government. I'm also here to lend my support to those who are calling on the city to call for an opioid crisis. So I visit my clients in shelters, on the streets, and in drop-in centers throughout the city. The conditions in the shelter system are unsafe, inadequate, and inhumane. I do agree with you, Mr. Mayor, when I say that we can't continue to expand the shelter system indefinitely. However, I'm not prepared to explain to my 6-year-old daughter that another person has died a truly preventable death on the streets of Toronto this year. For this reason, I'm here to support the call to expand the emergency shelter system, in addition to call for a plan which involves the rollout of affordable and supportive housing. I'm also here to express my concern regarding the rhetoric that is being used to describe this crisis. Mayor Tory, you've noted that around 50% of homeless residents are suffering from mental health and addictions issues. This may be true, but this statement, devoid of context, is very dangerous. It's dangerous because it could lead some to believe that those living on the streets in this city have caused their own demise. This statement deflects the fact that it is actually government inaction.
Thank you, ma'am.
I'm not finished. I'll be finished in a moment.
Madam, we have
I have a comment on housing now, and I will finish.
Madam, I understand that, and with all due respect, we have 28 deputies.
Yeah, and I have.
The committee agreed.
One more.
Madam, the committee agreed.
One of the councillors has.
So I do have concrete. Very short.
Madam, we're going to go to questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor's going to ask you a question.
Thank you. Questions? The one question I will not entertain, Councillor Cressy, is do you have anything to add? Because that is not the purpose behind asking questions, to extend deputation's time. Thank you, Councillor Cressy.
I understand you have some thoughts on the Housing Now proposal, and I'm wondering if you could share those with the committee, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I do. So I would like to point out that this model, there are many successful models, actually, none of which are included in the Housing Now report, that actually help people to be housed and not return to the street. Housing is a precondition to health and human right. So this plan, for example, is top-heavy. It's quite bureaucratic. It falls short of creating truly affordable and supporting housing options for the most marginalized in our city. We don't need to allocate housing to those who need housing the least. This report is vague. It talks about the requirement of participations of nonprofits and cooperatives, but we don't need vague language. I would also say I have concerns about the fact that there are no concrete targets revolving the involvement of nonprofits, cooperatives, and there are actually no concrete targets when we're talking about units for homeless people. So we need a more ambitious plan. We need all levels of government involved, and really, we needed it yesterday. Thank you very much.
Okay. I will also advise members of the committee that the clapping is not an arrangement that is generally acceptable, and that's the way we operate in here. The individuals who come regularly already know that, but for the new people, hopefully we can follow those same rules. So the next deputant is, yes? Oh, sure. Do you have any?
Councillor Cressy is not a member of the committee, but
Pardon me?
Councillor Cressy is not a member of the committee, so non-member asked question. Just wondered whether or not members of the committee would also have an opportunity to be able to ask questions.
Yeah, I have no,
No, but you were going to go to the next. I just wanted to ask.
yeah, no. Guests of the committee can, members council can ask questions.
Right, so it's in the member.
Yeah, that's what we
okay,
normally
great.
do. Okay,
Yes.
very good. Daphne Nussbaum?
No, I had questions for.
Oh, sorry.
That's what I was getting at.
Is that?
He's here, yes.
Is Amy still here? Councillor Thompson had questions for you.
Thank you. Good morning, ma'am, and thank you very much for coming. And good morning to your child's name? Deborah. Hi, good morning. I just wondered whether or not you had a copy of your presentation this morning that you'd like to submit to the clerk
I
so that
would
we
love
may have
to.
an opportunity to review it based on your recommendations.
Yes, I do, and I would love to. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That's all I wanted to ask. Thank
Any
you.
further questions? No? All right. Daphne Nussbaum. Welcome. You have 3 minutes?
It's working? Yeah. Good morning. I'm here on behalf of the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about the Housing Now initiative. We are encouraged by the steps the city is taking towards providing opportunities to increase affordable housing development and are pleased to be back working with you and the entire City Council on ending chronic homelessness in Toronto. It is important to note that we are in a better place than a year ago with respect to shelter support and emergency services for those experiencing homelessness. That being said, entering a shelter or respite is not possible for everyone outside, and homelessness still remains a crisis in the city. The senseless deaths at the beginning of 2019 of 2 women experiencing homelessness, Crystal Papineau and Hang Vo, along with the shelters and respites being at or over capacity, and the recent cold snap further highlights the urgent need for more deeply affordable and supportive housing that people experiencing chronic homelessness can more readily access. To make this a reality, we need to get out of the homelessness management business and focus on more housing options to end it once and for all. To that end, above what is currently planned, we do not support further shelter expansion. To share a quote I heard recently, "It doesn't take a village, but a city." The city is moving in the right direction towards more affordable housing, and there are many commendable aspects of the Housing Now initiative, which include a much stronger effort by the city to bring its housing divisions and structures together to address the continuum of housing and support responses needed, the introduction of a housing secretariat to manage the overall implementation of the Housing Now initiative, including directing city activity on pre-development work and planning guidance, making it easier for both nonprofit and private developers to create new affordable rental and supportive housing units in Toronto, and including the provision of a nonprofit housing capacity fund and the provision of flexible delegated approvals. The intention of making a coordinated submission to the Federal National Housing Supply Co-Investment Fund, which is essential to set up the city as a key local enabler and facilitator and ensure Toronto gets its share of these critical federal resources. While these are all welcome, Housing Now can go further in making a significant dent in ending chronic homelessness. To that effect, we have the following recommendations. Allocate a portion of the land surplus to deeply affordable and supportive housing. We need to ensure that at least 1/3 of the 11 surplus sites are allocated for deeply affordable and supportive housing for people experiencing chronic homelessness. Because most people experiencing homelessness in Toronto have very low income, a mechanism will be required to ensure that these 3,000 plus targeted units are affordable for this population. allocate a portion of the National Housing Strategy resources to build and/or create housing for people experiencing chronic homelessness. In earlier deputations and communications, the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness has advocated that a portion of the National Housing Strategy resources be designated to build and/or create housing for people experiencing chronic homelessness.
Madam, you're past your 3 minutes.
We are. Okay, wow.
So,
All right. I have submitted this online as well.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Questions? Yes.
First of all, thank you for being here. On housing related to chronic homelessness that you touched on, should part of Housing Now, the program in front of us, include transitional or supportive housing so that we are providing means to end chronic homelessness?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Thank you.
Any further questions of the deputant? No? Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Joe Deschenes? Welcome.
Thank you. I'm Joe Deshane Smith. I'm with Trillium Housing Nonprofit. We call ourselves the most cost-effective model for the delivery of housing affordability in Canada, and I'm here to talk about the outcomes using a former surplus city land site that we're currently building on, and tell you we really want you to support this initiative and to move forward with the 11 sites. We think real housing affordability can be achieved on those sites, and you should do it. I was looking at the staff reports and the occupations of folks who are going to live in these units: dental assistants, social worker, secretary, security guards, early childhood education, registered nurses, auditors, teachers. Actually, those are the names of people who are purchasing units at our site, a surplus city site, here in Toronto under construction. Same type of positions as who are going to be housed in this proposed model here, but using an ownership model that Trillium Housing has initiated over the last 2 years. If you look at the process, we bought the land through a competitive bid process against for-profit developers. Trillium Housing Nonprofit is putting additional support into housing affordability over and above what the city is providing as a loan. There is 0 grants going into our project. It's such a good model, I believe the staff at Build Trio at Toronto at the time wanted to replicate it. We are supporting 33 purchaser families at our project at The Loop with Trillium Mortgages. The average household income is $66,000. It's a 62-unit development. So we achieved over 50% of the units delivered as affordable housing to the families. Those Trillium Mortgages work out to about $100,000 each. It saves a family on a monthly housing cost $500 a month. Put it into your mortgage calculator, you'll see that outcome is there. They will receive a share of the equity at the resale point. If you look at the contribution from the city, there are loans to the project that are fully secured, that convert into support for the Trillium Mortgages and match up with the Trillium Housing dollars that we're putting in. There are no grants provided, and we're achieving outcomes similar to what's happening with the rental programs. So my final, my ask here today is please proceed with the sale of the redevelopment of these sites. I would ask that you consider including affordable ownership as part of the program. Let us show you what we can do on these sites to deliver housing, ownership housing that families will build equity in, that is similar to those incomes of the families that will be provided rental housing at a much higher cost. I'll add, we paid full DCs and charges, $2.5 million in DCs and charges were paid to the city as we redeveloped the site. We paid market value for the land, over $3 million. It was, I think, less than $1.5 million in city loans that were provided to the project and federal provincial dollars. I should acknowledge, I have 1 second, that the province supported us with a pilot guarantee on this project. I'm done. I'm sorry I went over,
you, sir.
and
Thanks for staying
I
within
would
the limit.
discuss with anyone after if necessary.
Thank you, sir. Any questions of the deputant? No? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Cressy, could you take your little meeting there outside? It's distracting. Thank you. Maggie Helwig, Reverend Maggie Helwig. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you. Yes, I am the Reverend Maggie Helwig from the Church of St. Stephen in the Fields and also the chair of the Social Justice and Advocacy Committee of the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. I am going to endorse what the first couple of speakers mentioned, the need to treat the situation of homelessness in Toronto as a crisis, as an emergency. I am seeing affordable rental units being eroded day by day as market rents spiral out of control, as people are evicted from units which had been affordable by means which are in some cases frankly illegal, as housing is displaced by Airbnbs. We all know this is happening. We know that there are 9,000, 10,000 people without homes in Toronto, that every emergency center that opens is packed instantly. We all know this. This is an upstream problem. We can't solve it by opening more and more domes. We've reached the point where we have to campaign to allow people to continue sleeping under the gardener. We have to solve this by creating rent-geared to income housing and transitional and affordable housing. And those were words I did not hear a single time in the presentation by city staff, and that distresses me. We talk about affordability by pinning it to market rent. We talk about affordability as 80% of market rent, which is madness. Even 40% of market rent increasingly barely equates to affordability. I didn't hear rent geared to income a single time. I didn't hear supportive housing. I didn't hear transitional housing. 80% of market rent as affordable housing is like building a bridge 20% of the way over a ravine. Building a bridge 40% of the way over a ravine doesn't actually get you a whole lot further. We need to talk about rent geared to income rather than linking to affordable market rent as affordable market rent spirals and spirals in this crazy way it's doing. We need to talk about transitional and affordable housing. In the interim, we need a minimum of 2,000 shelter beds opened immediately. They would fill up. There's no question they would fill up. We need supports for people who are living on the street. And regarding the fact that 50% of people on the street have mental health and addiction issues, if you lived on the street, you would have mental health and addiction issues. I'm astonished it's as low as 50%. The stresses and humiliations of being without housing are beyond what you can imagine if you have not got firsthand experience of it. And we need to take that into account as well. I am at 3 minutes. I will conclude.
Thank you very much. And do we have any questions of the deputy? Councillor Cressy?
Thank you, Maggie. I'm sorry I'm not your local councillor anymore with the new wards.
No, it's Mike's okay.
Mike's okay. You mentioned, one quote you mentioned was that we can't solve homelessness by opening more and more domes. And so with respect then to housing now in city-owned land, what would you like to see in these properties as we seek to provide housing opportunities to end homelessness?
I would like to see a minimum of 1/3 of those units be designated not as affordable, but as rent geared to income. A minimum of 1/3, probably more like a half, rent geared to income, and a significant portion of those be devoted to specialized supportive and transitional housing.
Okay, so some to include supportive housing within the Housing Now program
Yes.
as well, along with affordability targets on income. Okay,
Yep.
Thank you, Maggie.
Any further questions? Councillor Bylaw.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us here today. I'm just wondering if you're aware that this proposal requires that 10% of the affordable units are 40%, which actually translates in a $500 one-bedroom apartment.
I addressed that. I did mention that.
So that is the same as rent geared to income for a one-bedroom.
Well, as long as it's geared to average market rent, and average market rent keeps going up and up and up, 40% of average market rent has the potential to become meaningless.
Well,
I mean, we're not seeing any moderation in the spinning out of control of average market rent. So as long as it's tied to that measure, rather than being described as rent geared to income, it is in danger of also becoming unaffordable. Also, 10% is a pretty tiny amount considering the housing crisis that's facing us. 10% I would much rather see it constructed as rent geared to income than pinned to average market rent. But even if you're pinning it to 40% of average market rent, we need more than 10%.
Yeah, absolutely. We do. That's why we usually say that this is the first step of many steps that are needed here in the city, right? The first package of what we hope to be many packages.
I understand that, but also when you have perhaps 10,000 people without homes,
Yep.
you know, it's not a big enough step. This is a much bigger crisis than can be addressed.
So one of the things that the rent geared to income had a very high subsidy from province and the federal government, correct? You're aware of that. The rent geared to income system has a very high subsidy from provincial and federal government. The provincial and federal government are moving away from that, and for example, we're having a housing subsidy that's starting next year that can be stacked into these programs. So you could have somebody living in one of these affordable units and receiving the housing benefit that comes from the federal government. It's just the system that is being in place. So these new projects are also managing to work with the new realities that were provided to us by the provincial and federal government. Are you aware?
I am aware of this. I do not think that this is addressing the situation in Toronto and the magnitude of the housing crisis in Toronto. I understand that you are dealing with a very difficult situation with the provincial government, and I understand that the federal government is not stepping up to the extent that we would like to see. And I am perfectly happy to assist you in lobbying the provincial and federal governments for more help with housing in Toronto.
Thank you. And that is greatly appreciated. And I know that many of you have done it for many, many years, and we appreciate your voice to join us on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, you had a question. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Reverend, thank you very much for being here this morning. Appreciate it. I just wanted to ask you, because I think it's important, it's the second time, if not maybe the third, it's come up this morning, within the context of people suffering from mental health and addiction. First of all, you'll acknowledge, I'm sure, that the number that's being used is a number that came out of the city's census that was done of homeless people.
I'm not denying the number.
Right. And I hope you'll acknowledge as well that when I've raised it, and I will just say to you that subject to you having better advice as to how I can do it, I will continue to raise it, and I'm addressing more the comment of the first deputant that I heard when I came in the room, more so than yourself. But I've raised it, I think, and I hope you'll agree, without exception, within the context of compassion and the need to raise awareness of this fact, because it is an important part of solving the problem, which is we don't just need an affordable housing unit for the people who are suffering from mental illness and addiction. We need supportive housing for them. And that I'm trying to make the point that within the context of the issue that you talk about in broad terms, there are different components of it for different people. And that I think that necessitates, unless you have a better advice, continuing to talk about half the people we're dealing with here, let's say, are people that have special needs, not just for a housing unit, but for a housing unit plus. And I just think if we don't get that message across to the other governments, we will not solve the problem of those people, most importantly in terms of addressing their issues in the context of housing. But if you had other advice for me, I'm asking you to give it to me, because I intend to be crusading on this more so than ever before, because I think it's a huge part of solving the problem.
It is a significant part of solving the problem. There certainly are people who are currently homeless who need additional supports, and we're both talking about supportive housing. We both know that. I think that, you know, you may have very good motives in continuing to talk about that figure, but it's something we need to be careful with, because there is such a tremendous tendency in our society to stigmatize people experiencing homelessness, to stigmatize people experiencing mental health difficulties, to stigmatize people with addictions. And when you start layering that stigma, that kind of figure, even when brought forward with the best motives, can become a way of turning it into those people, those bad people, those people with their addictions, those people with their craziness. And it is also important to bear in mind, as I said, in many cases, homelessness aggravates, or in some cases creates, the mental health and addiction issues. That living on the street, living in a shelter, is a level of trauma in and of itself. that is extreme, and certainly.
I'll certainly acknowledge that, and I guess just in the remaining time, do you have any advice? I mean, you know, you sort of find yourself in a situation where if you don't raise it, people say you don't raise it. If you do raise it, they're saying, well, you can't raise it. In that context, would you have any advice for me as to how, you know, if you were to be articulating this as I have an intense desire to do, as well as a responsibility to do as mayor, to the federal government and to the public?
If you don't mind if I do a little copy editing of what something you just said,
By all
you used the
means.
phrase "those people."
Did I just use that expression?
You used the phrase "those people."
Right.
If we could really stay away from language like "those people," if we could stay away from language that stigmatizes, that others, that makes people experiencing homelessness or people experiencing mental illness seem like people different from us. I feel confident a lot of people in this room have dealt with mental health challenges. It's very common in the society in general.
Fair enough. Thank you for the
It's not
advice.
something only homeless people experience.
Thank you for the advice, and you make a good point, and I'm glad that I asked you the question. Thank you.
All righty. Daryl Chong, President of the Greater Toronto Apartment Association.
Good morning, thank you, and welcome back, everyone. So, Mr. Mayor, we applaud you and the committee and council for bringing this initiative forward. It proceeds a different way. It looks at a best use rather than highest value disposition method, which is more results oriented. A year ago, the province followed your open door initiative and did an RFP for the West Don lands and the Grosvenor Grenville sites. This again follows sort of on the heels of the open door initiative, which we think is a very good program with lots of success. All governments, their ABCs and crown corporations own significant land assets. Perhaps another way to go forward is to have an inventory taken of all these land assets, including their current and future potential uses, as a way to compile a list of the next set of sites for Housing Now. We would love to build more rental housing if we could. The cost of land acquisition is probably the biggest impediment. There's also some very big challenges on zoning in terms of time and the ability to get zoning. This program provides land. The land comes pre-zoned, as I think it's going to happen, and it's going to also create a housing secretariat to make things a lot faster. So the combination of land, zoning, and speed are probably the three biggest factors affecting our inability to build rental housing. So the report recognizes the urgency in providing housing quickly and provides a list of recommendations to make that happen. We look forward to the next steps, and congratulations on moving forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions of the deputant? Councillor Pasternak?
Thank you, Deputy City Manager, Mayor. When it comes to the apartment association, what many of us look to are rent supplement agreements and the willingness of owners to execute those for their tenants. Can you just talk for a minute? We're getting some resistance at the local level about the willingness to execute rent supplement agreements. I'm wondering whether your association supports them, can encourage them, can expedite them.
Yeah, we support them and we encourage them. It's up to individual companies whether they have available units to take them in or not. But we do encourage and promote them on behalf of the city.
Now, when one comes off the books, is there an encouragement to extend it or renew it, or?
So the rent supplicant comes with the tenant, it's not fixed to the unit.
But we need the agreement of the owner to execute their end of it.
So you're suggesting that when one tenant leaves that had an arrangement with the city for rent supplement?
Yeah, it's not a portable housing benefit, it's a rent supplement agreement that requires the owner to sign their half of it.
Right, so the way it works is a tenant would move in with a rent supplement, and the city would send part of the rent directly to the landlord, and the tenant would pay the balance. When that tenant leaves, then the unit just becomes vacant. Presumably, we could go back to the city and say, we have a vacant unit. Do you have somebody else that wants it? I don't know what the arrangement, typically we don't.
Now, you mentioned that it's harder and harder to build bricks and mortar, purpose-built rental. And I understand that in in a city where land values are very expensive. But what we're getting, at least in the inner suburbs, is more applications for infill on existing large sites where there's been apartment buildings standing there for decades, and they're finally building units there. Are you encouraging your membership to build on those infill sites, or is that sort of a neutral policy that they?
No, absolutely. We encourage them to build on the infill where the land is essentially at zero cost. We just spent lots of time and effort at the OMB, or LPAT as it's called now, challenging the city's OPA 320, which put up more restrictions on infill. So we got some mediated concessions from the city, but that's one of the zoning challenges. The OPA 320 that the city adopted a year ago in April makes it even more difficult. So we haven't been doing a lot of infill even at land cost being zero. It just speaks to the economics of building rental housing.
Would you say that if there's more rental housing stock, it puts downward pressure on existing rentals, or it's basically revenue neutral?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of units that are occupied by people that would have, in a healthier market, housing market, would have moved up and out of those units to make them available for new families, immigrants, and people of lower income. But they stay where they are because there's nowhere to go. So any input into the system, more units at any price point, frees up existing units that are occupied.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Mayor.
Just one question, and thank you very much for being here. And the answer may well aggravate our very excellent chief planner, or our excellent city solicitor, or any combination of the above, but don't worry about that. They'll get over it. If I had to ask you to name one thing, and we get put into these positions all the time, to name the one thing when you went back to the sort of challenges of approval, because that's a big thing that stands in front of us as a challenge to get these units on stream as soon as possible. If you had to name the one thing or the one area that requires the most attention on our part to move forward the approval of purpose-built rental, including affordable, what would it be?
The cumulative effect of all the fees.
Oh, no, but that's okay. That's about money, but I'm talking about the approval process. Because you made reference to that being something that gets us bogged down.
Well, so for following on the heels of Open Door, all the stuff that you currently have as initiatives of Open Door and in the proposed housing now that expedite the process would be much appreciated across the board for all purpose-built rental, if that's the goal of the city, to get more.
There's not one particular place where it gets bogged down more often than not that really represents to you an obvious place we should be really focused on and kind of removing the impediments.
At the front end, just getting the rezoning approval is probably the biggest challenge, and the appeals that come with that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Nunziata?
Just on that point, so when you say expedite, are you suggesting that pre-zoned as well for other properties?
Well, so I believe the 11 sites in this document will come pre-zoned.
Yeah, but other sites that come forward that are not city.
So on an infill, the site is already zoned, and there are already 2 or 3 apartment buildings on it, or whatever may be there. So it's already zoned. What we need is upzoning then, to add another tower.
And what about a site that doesn't have the zoning and doesn't have another site?
So I know pre-zoning is something that's been discussed as a way to move
For
forward.
example, let's say it's deployment lands.
The port lands might work if it's pre-zoned and the density is high.
For employment lands, I'm referring to.
Sorry?
Employment
Oh,
lands.
employment lands.
Yeah.
Employment lands are another opportunity. We know there are a lot of industrial sites where industry is just not coming back.
Right.
So they need to be rezoned. When you rezone them, if you consider higher density or specific use like purpose-built rental, that would certainly help.
To expedite those projects.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All righty. No further questions? Thanks, Darrell.
Thank you.
Our next deputant is Jean Stevenson, Executive Director, Madison Community Services. Welcome.
Let's see. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Jean Stevenson. I am here on behalf of the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm on the TAH Steering Committee, and I am the Executive Director of Madison Community Services. Madison is a community-based nonprofit agency which serves individuals with mental health and addiction challenges. Our services, like many other supportive housing organizations, include supportive housing with wraparound case management supports. Our clients all live below the poverty line, most receiving Ontario disability shelter allowances of the grand sum of $489 a month for housing. Most of our clients were homeless or at risk of homelessness before coming to Madison or to another supportive housing agency. Some still are, due to the crisis-level shortage of affordable rental housing in Toronto and the shortage of rent supplement funding. My colleagues from the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness, both Daphna, who's already spoken, and Brian Davis is soon to come, will speak in support of the Housing Now initiative, but with very specific recommendations for making it stronger and much more focused on supporting and partnering with the nonprofit housing and supportive housing sectors to focus this initiative, this specific initiative, the first of hopefully many to come, on homelessness, on ending homelessness. What I would like to add to what my colleagues are putting forward and others have so eloquently put forward as well, is I'd like to use this as the opportunity to remind the Executive Committee that what the TAEH is recommending is in fact a best practice in other countries around the world, other parts of Canada, and it had been an exemplar of best practice in the mid-70s, 80s, and 90s. It's not that it didn't happen or that it can't happen. It can, and hopefully it will be. In Canada, though, I wanted to put forward a shining example of one recent best practice in addressing homelessness recently carried out by the City of Vancouver. Since September 2017, the City of Vancouver has created a total of over 600 units of self-contained apartments for people who are on the street, or shelters. These self-contained homes were created in just 5 months. The key elements for making this possible was, and these are just a few, that these are modular housing, which can be manufactured quickly and locally, and then on-site assembly can be completed within 90 days. The homes were built on city-owned sites.
Can I ask you to finish up, please?
Yes?
Thank you. Questions of the deputant? Yes, Councillor Cressy.
Good to see you again, Jane.
Good to see you again, Joe.
So in terms of the Housing Now and looking to best case examples elsewhere, including in Canada, do I understand you correctly? You talked about the importance of the nonprofit sector and supportive housing. Mm-hmm. In both of those areas, where should we be looking to strengthen this report?
I would say in terms of the, as I say, the Toronto Alliance has a number of very specific recommendations. But what I would say is that a key element will be, and that's the way it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Toronto, was to really look at the nonprofit and the supportive housing sectors as partners in the process, and to actually make a very much higher percentage. We're putting forward 1/3 of in the Housing Now initiative to be dedicated to. So
for my benefit and the committee's benefit, when it comes to the inclusion of supportive housing as a tool towards ending homelessness, along with supportive housing moving into permanent housing, why is the nonprofit sector so critical to the delivery of supportive housing?
The many reasons, but one key one is that by virtue of being not-for-profit, is that this housing is being held in trust for the purpose of serving the population that we are to serve in perpetuity, forever. And so we need to be adding to that stock. We have a stock of that already in Toronto, but they're all filled up to the brim, and we need to be adding a lot more. But that's one of quite a number of important reasons why the city should be focusing on recognizing that this is an important thing that should be thought about. We want to keep this in the public realm. And
Is it fair to say then, when it comes to supportive housing, that in many cases supportive housing is a harder to house population, and therefore if it's left up to the market as opposed to nonprofits, it won't be embedded in the model?
Absolutely. So that's why a focus on nonprofit supportive housing is what the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness is recommending.
Thank you, Jean.
Other nonprofits.
Further questions? Thank you.
Did I still have some time in my speaking time, or?
No, we were into your question time, but
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I appreciate your creativity.
Thank you.
Oh, what? Councillor Thompson wants to.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't sure. Did you have some recommendations? Did you have some recommendations as part of your presentation?
I am here as part of the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness, and we have put forward recommendations.
So you're okay? Okay, you're
Yeah.
associated with that group, and
Yeah,
okay.
but the one thing,
I didn't know if you had something additional.
No, I was just also going to suggest that in line with best practices, please hark back to and maybe pull out the files on the creation of the St. Lawrence neighborhood, because that was a classic example. 57% of the housing built in the St. Lawrence neighborhood was allocated to nonprofit housing cooperatives, municipal, private, et cetera. And that has worked very, very well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Okay. Matthew Kilway.
Good morning, and thank you very much. My name is Matthew Kelway, formerly Member of Parliament for Beaches East York, formerly Chair of the Out of the Cold program at St. Aidan's in the Beach, formerly many things, but here this morning to do my best to impress upon you the enormity of the housing issue that we have in this city, and to urge you to reconsider the initiative before you. And I'm suggesting to you that the Housing Now initiative is an insufficient response to the problem that we have. We know this housing problem by way of the numbers, and we know that this problem has been at least a generation in the making, starting with the federal government saying we're not doing housing anymore, followed immediately by a provincial government that said not us either, over to you cities. But we're here too because our city didn't accept responsibility either, and the result is not just a housing crisis, but a homelessness crisis too, one that has overwhelmed clearly our shelter system. The 90% capacity standard set by the city and in place for over 15 years is night after night exceeded by a long shot. These days, nearly 7,000 people seek shelter in that system, and we have been so inattentive to the housing question in this city that a new layer of emergency sheltering has been added to the system. Hundreds of homeless every night are now sheltered in makeshift temporary structures and temporary locations, which is to say, in wholly inadequate and too often unhealthy, unsafe, and inhumane conditions, conditions that fail to recognize the dignity and the worth of human beings. So it remains not just a crisis, but now something deeper, something deadlier. For some time now, about 2 people every week on average have been dying in this city because they're homeless. This is a tragedy that this month took a grotesque turn with the deaths of Crystal Papineau, trapped in the mouth of a clothing bin until she died there, with the death of Hangbo, crushed by a garbage truck while asleep on a grate. And so please, when this matter comes before council, declare this the emergency that it is, because we need immediately to fast-track the remaining sprung structures and reduce overcrowding in our shelter system, increase outreach, and to fund and provide overdose prevention sites and measures. And in so declaring this an emergency, engage other levels of government in this Housing Now initiative to ensure that it is properly responsive to the depth and urgency of this issue. And that, more than anything else, entails using all 11 available city sites for deeply affordable rental. We need supportive housing for the 14,000 Toronto residents living with serious and persistent mental health challenges. We need rent geared to income, accommodation for rent according to a measure of affordability that is meaningful and helpful in the context of a city that is in the midst of a housing crisis, a homelessness crisis, and by any reasonable assessment, a humanitarian catastrophe.
Thank you, Mr. Kilway. Questions of the deputy? No? Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
The next deputant is Brian Davis, HouseLink Community Homes. Welcome.
Good morning. So my name is Brian Davis. I'm the Executive Director of HouseLink Community Homes, and to my right is Gautam Mukherjee, who is the Executive Director of Mainstay Housing. We're both Ministry of Health city-funded supportive housing providers for people with serious mental health challenges, addiction issues, and often folks who are coming with long histories of homelessness. So I'm deputing as the chair of the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness Housing Development Working Group. This group is a group of nonprofit providers in Toronto who are actively and collectively identifying the resources, strategies, and solutions to spur the acquisition, development, and renovation of quality rental housing stock accessible to individuals experiencing chronic homelessness. Supportive housing is a significant part of what the city must support in this Housing Now initiative, and we believe there's an opportunity here to utilize these 11 surplus lands and accompanying recommendations of funding for the city not only to make good on its commitment to create 18,000 supportive housing units in the next 10 years, but also do a whole lot of catching up. TAH commends the Housing Now initiative as a big and bold step forward. But we need this opportunity and the accompanying additional funding to actually build a solid exit strategy at the scale to match the emergency we have outside these walls. To this end, regarding the targeted portion of deeply affordable units, we believe the city is missing a great opportunity to target a full 1/3 of these 10,000 units to those who experience chronic homelessness. I want to ask why this report doesn't even mention supportive housing. Why doesn't this report talk about social assistance rates? And as Jean said, someone on ODSP gets under $500, and I don't think that's going to go up in the near future. So we believe that this is achievable on a number of fronts. As Councillor Bilal spoke about, stacking operational capital funding from other programs. We know that the National Housing Strategy is actually targeting ending homelessness across Canada. Seek partnerships with the Ministry of Health and health service providers like ourselves and others who are part of TAEH to provide rent supplements as well as support dollars in concert with local health integrated networks. Some of you may know that some of us are sitting on rent supplements that we can't use because the vacancy rate in the City of Toronto is so incredibly low. We also are at that point where because of exorbitant prices, we're actually losing mental health rent supplement units because of the market trends. Finally, we would strongly recommend a stronger preference to mission-driven, nonprofit housing providers which have the expertise in fostering inclusive and integrated communities. This will ensure that affordable housing units are A, secured in perpetuity, B, we're able to flex support up and down as the need arises for the folks that live there, and C, conduct landlord functions in a manner that maximizes housing stability.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Not done.
Thank you. Any questions of the deputant? Yeah, Councillor Cressy.
Well, thank you for being here, Brian. You had very specific suggestions related to the 1/3, the 3,700 units here, and the need to include supportive housing as the priority for those. Do you have other recommendations on behalf of the Toronto Alliance for Housing Now?
Just really quickly, the new Planning and Housing Committee, the role of the Housing Secretariat, I think this is an opportunity, as Councillor Bilal said, to have a fresh approach about how we look at expanding supportive and nonprofit housing in the City of Toronto. A number of us are sitting on nonprofit lands that can be renewed and expanded, and we need to look at creating moving the annual open door into a revolving door, and start fast-tracking approval process, as Jean spoke about.
Can I follow up with a question on that? So, not as the Alliance, but as HouseLink, you're a supportive housing provider. Traditionally, when it comes to supportive housing, this has been administered by the city in many ways, but funded through the province. And so I guess the question here I have, not that we should ever stop our advocacy for provincial support. But if we don't have a provincial partner, does the city and the federal government need to fill that void?
Yes, I think ideally they do.
Okay.
You want to speak to that? Or?
Councillor Fletcher?
Recently, not so recently, you've given the city an idea of one of the issues that supportive housing providers have when they have buildings currently existing, and then you have men mostly in your buildings, aging, and they're unable to do the walk-up that previously had sustained them or been sufficient for them. So this is just an issue of now what do we do with elderly who are in your supportive housing units? And how can the city help make that possible to transition those who are in supportive housing who are aging into a place where they're going to have an elevator and where you can maximize your asset, which is the building you own and the land you own?
So thank you, Councillor Fletcher. As a few of you know, we've had a fully funded Ministry of Health proposal at the city that it's been stalled at a variety of fronts, planning, create TO. We do have an aging population. We were looking at leveraging the capital of those lands. They're worth a lot of money, but they're hard to rent, hard to fill, and creating innovative, self-contained, accessible units and on the Danforth. And one of the recommendations that the city needs to consider new ways of creating compromises in our planning regiment to do a cost-benefit analysis to make sure that if we're saying no to a certain property, we're knowing the loss of the supportive housing that is going to be realized. And I can speak about the 1.3 meters distance of a particular set of windows, but I won't go there.
So I guess this is the housing plan in front of us, or the Housing Now plan, but this is just the beginning of a much larger look at what's necessary. And would you flag for us that for supportive housing, we have to take into account the buildings that don't have elevators that currently exist, the populations that are aging who will have nowhere to go if they can't walk up a number of flights of stairs?
That's right.
And perhaps we need to have a special look at how providers like yourself can redevelop your properties to sustain those who are living there.
And that's what I'm hoping that the new staffing roles will be able to help shepherd nonprofits like ourselves, Mainstay, there's a number of us, who have significant capital in the downtown core that we can look at leveraging, intensifying, but shepherd those through the application process, make sure that the open door program doesn't create a barrier. What I've been told by staff is that it favors the for-profit sector. We need to make sure that the nonprofit sector is there for all the reasons that I stated earlier.
And how many properties do you have?
So
How many properties?
HouseLink has 22,
Councillor
Mainstay
Fletcher.
has 41.
22 properties, thank you.
You just have to work within the 3-minute.
I'm sorry, my
right.
apologies.
Councillor Bylaw.
So out of, in your operations, how much is it, are you funded by the province and how much are you funded by the city? Can you share that with us?
Well, off the top of my head, I'd say 80% is Ministry of Health. And I mean, recently we've been getting a transitions team to help people with the portable housing benefits. That's about $1 million. So it's about.
So 80% of your operational costs are by the province?
That's correct.
So through this open door, through this program, what you're asking us is to assist with creating the bricks and mortar part of it because you feel comfortable that you're going to get your operation dollars from the Ministry of Health, or you need us to work together to advocate for that as well?
Well, advocate and work together because we could do better coordination between Ministry of Health funding, LINT funding, our rent supplements, and the work that the city.
So it's that stacking that I was talking about.
yeah, and
Like we need to be
coordination, yeah.
smarter about leveraging the dollars and sitting down and seeing, okay, there's an opportunity here.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we talk about supportive housing, but the bulk of the funding comes from the Ministry of Health as it is right now. So what we need to do is what I was talking about, it's understand that there's new realities and new tools coming, housing benefits, Ministry of Health, and so on, and we need to work closer with the sector to make sure we're targeting the individuals that need it the most using what we have available to us.
And you're right, and we have to work differently as a sector as well. So.
And the other part that I heard you that we need to do a better job is on your sites, almost get out of the way. Like, be smarter about how we do the planning with you and give you priority.
Stop creating barriers and be a problem solver with us.
I believe we have a charrette coming up soon.
We do.
Okay.
Councillor Barlow, could I just add? I think if there's alignment that we have a homelessness issue and that housing is a key part of the solution to that. Our starting point on the Alliance, as you've heard a few times, is to allocate a third of the units to people experiencing chronic homelessness. And I think coming together around that means we can't get something for nothing. Certainly, the Toronto Alliance and the health-funded providers, we're absolutely prepared and ready to engage with the city. And I think that includes engaging with the city on the site-by-site business case development to maximize the number of supportive housing units that can be created. The other really concrete kind of recommendation I would make is let's not look to recoup costs in the transactions. These sites can be transacted to the nonprofit sector, ensure that the value of the sites remains in the system in perpetuity, and then we can work backwards to drive the savings in the transactions into affordable rents for people coming out of chronic homelessness.
Agree. And do you think it was an important step to put that $1 million here to actually assist the nonprofit and the co-op sector to work with us on these sites? Because we do realize that we need to actually take this opportunity not only to work closer with the sector, but actually strengthen the sector using these tools?
We also do have a lot of capacity in the sector, so I think it's really good that the city's added a resource to engage with us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Andrew Marchinak.
Hi. Good morning. Well, I am not Andrew, as you can see. My name is Alejandra, and I represent ACORN.
I'm Ebony Menzies. I am also a member of ACORN, but today Alejandra will be doing the speaking.
So we're going to start to sing the same song that ACORN has been singing for a while, some years now. So as I told you, my name is Alejandra Ruiz. I forgot to say hi to everybody. How are you? Okay. So my name is Alejandra Ruiz, and I represent ACORN. ACORN is an organization that fights for social change. We are low-income and moderate-income people. When we heard about this Housing Now initiative, our hope thermometer went to the roof. But when we started to read it a little bit more further, we noticed that our hopes went low again. Housing Now initiative is okay, but it can be but it's not good enough. Our ACORN knows that the city can do better and should do better. 30% of affordable housing in the 11 lands is not enough. In a city that last year in June was considered the 5th most unaffordable city in the whole wide world. The affordability period is not too clear, and in the report, there are some pieces that are difficult to understand. The fees, incentives for developers are too high to receive too little from the deal. Toronto Community Housing, as everybody knows in this room, or did you know, we're telling you that there are 100 people or 100 households in the waiting list, in the housing waiting list. So why the city always invites us to the party, but always gives us the small slice of cake? Why always housing has to be sacrificed? I know that you have good intentions, but we cannot live more from good intentions anymore. we urge the city to raise the percentage of affordable housing. These arrangements housing to the housing initiative that is offering is not affordable for low income and moderate income. The city is contributing that people that are already wealthier become more wealthier in our backs. Fight for us like you can. Fight for us like we are your family. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any questions of the deputy? Councillor Fletcher?
Little question. Hi.
Hi, Paula.
One of the things that we've realized over the last while is that the TCHC redevelopments, which there are about 5 or 6, have no new affordable housing on those sites. It's simply replacement. Would you support trying to have a different balance on lands that are owned by the city or by TCHC and through, obviously, the end owner of the city? Do you think that's good enough, that we haven't built anything new over the last 10 years on those lands?
Well, no, it's not good enough. This is part of the problem. We need to do more social housing, and we totally agree that we need more social housing.
So any land owned,
Any land owned?
profit that have land, we should assist. Toronto Community Housing should endeavor to not replace, but also add new affordable. And we have these 11 sites that we're going to move out on. The 40% that Councillor Bailao mentioned, 540 a month, is pretty close to an RGI amount in the city, is it not?
Well, it's close, but it's not enough because it's only, imagine, I had 10 and you only give me 3. With this crisis that we had, it's not enough.
Do you think we should look at the ratio of
Yes.
the deep RGIs and actually understand how many we're going to be getting?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very
No
much.
more questions? Okay, thank you.
The next speaker, deputy, is Don White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, some people may call me a grumpy old man, but I am a social justice activist who's been in Toronto over 55 years. This is the worst damn housing emergency. And Mr. Mayor, please, and I ask the media, do not use the word crisis. It's an emergency. And you should wake up to the fact that this has been going on for years. It's not recent. We warned you, those of us who are activists, we warned you years ago that there would be an emergency. Kathy Crow, Barrick German, and other activists warned you. You did nothing. You sat on your ass and did virtually nothing to prevent this. So you know what? Just a few facts before I read my rant. There will be 10,000 homeless people by the summer. There are 6,000 people at least in the shelters. There are 180 co-ops in 47 co-ops in Toronto. And Maggie Helwick is right. We need rent geared to income. Rent geared to income to help the people who get a measly 500 or more bucks from ODSP that can't possibly pay for even half their rent. So this is a rant, and it expresses my feelings and the feelings of many on the street. And by the way, there are 4 to 5 people on the street I personally know within a 2 to 3 block area at Yonge and Eglinton. And the reason why they're on the street a lot is not just because there's a lack of housing, but they won't go back into the shelter because the shelters are violent and they're full of contagious sicknesses, and they don't want to get sick, and they're inhumane. Listen up, you do, and this is called Shelter Skelter. And it's a rant inspired by Mayor Tory and the Toronto City Council. Listen up, you do-nothing neoliberal right-wing hacks. Surprise, surprise, we're in the hall. We're in City Hall. We're back. We're back. Councillors shout housing strategy, poverty reduction. Another lie, you care about going to another Bay Street function.
Thank you, sir. Your time is up.
But you
I'm
don't.
sorry, your time is up. Everyone gets 3 minutes.
Are you interrupting me?
Yes, sir.
Why are you interrupting me?
Because everyone here, we treat everybody the same, which I'm sure you'll agree with, and everybody
Just a minute.
gets 3 minutes.
You are guilty of bias against me reading. It's not even 5 minutes.
Sorry, sir.
It's not even 5 minutes, and I'm being interrupted.
Sir, we have your document here, your rant. I think we've all seen it.
What? Why? No, I didn't. This'll take 1 minute, so please be understanding. I made a special point. I'm 88 years old, and I made a special point of coming down here to read this. So please understanding, you're supposed to represent the people.
I'm at the will of the committee.
Are you representing?
If I was in the chair, Mr. Chair, I would say that there's an 88-year-old discount or whatever it is, bonus that's applied. Anybody 88 and above might be given 1 minute only to do that, but we should make
Well, Mr. Mayor, hearing from one of our neoliberal right-wing hacks on the committee, I'm happy to. I'm considering myself one of those too, because we're all of that on this council. I'm happy to give you your extra minute.
I'll second that.
What is going on?
Sir, Mr.
I'm asking for
Mr.
one
Watts,
more
you
minute.
can continue. You can finish. Just
May I
move along.
continue?
They're going to give you 1 more minute.
Yes.
They'll give you 1 more minute.
Thank you. Okay, councillors shout housing strategy, poverty reduction. Another lie, you care more about going to another Bay Street function, but you don't give a damn about housing the homeless and poor, and you just care about another pay raise for sure, for sure. While you sit on your fat corporate co-opted ass, you ignore our issues, you take a pass. You refuse to name the housing crisis an emergency. City councilors are too deaf and blind to see the emergency. You refuse to build and fund more shelters and housing, more condos for the rich. The banks will cover your losses. While homeless brothers and sisters freeze on the street, you're thinking on the next. You're thinking for the next election who to beat: the homeless, poor, disabled, psychiatrist, Black, Indigenous. We're pissed off for not being treated as not one of us. You once promised 1,000 more shelter beds, 1,000 more shelter beds. Remember, that's what you said. That's what you said. And we know your words are token promises, broken promises. You won't open up Moss Park and Fort York armories on premises, thanks to OCAP protests and people's resistance. We're your worst nightmare, your fucking public resistance. 6,000 homeless, hungry, poor, brown psychiatrists, a street army on the march, no longer marginalized, marching, listening to drums beating and pounding, shouting, chanting, demanding, empowering. Housing, not shelters. Housing, not shelters. No more homeless deaths. No more homeless deaths. Listen up, Tory and City Council. Affordable housing is a human right. You damn well know what I said. We're ready to organize, struggle, and fight with brothers and sisters, black, brown, red, and white, all over this racist, stolen land. Toronto, goddamn. Toronto, goddamn. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next deputy. And I just want to caution everyone, because my colleagues reminded me, and this first term of council, You're not allowed to use curse words in this committee. There are rules and decorum. And I know he was using his, I think, artistic license, but just a reminder, bad language is not allowed in this room. And I'm sure Mary knows that, and
Mary has never used foul language.
I know she hasn't.
Well, she has not.
Welcome, Mary.
Do I
Nice to see you.
start at 0 or at 246?
We'll start, well, whatever you like.
I'd like 0.
Okay, we'll do that then.
I'm not sure I can follow this guy, but I'll do my best. First, thank you for taking the lead and creating needed rental accommodation. Thank you for not selling the 11 properties outright. Thank you for proposing 99-year leases instead of sell-offs. Thank you for wanting to kickstart a sustainable integrated housing program. But this step is a one-third measure at best. You are planning to create over 10,000 units, of which 3,240 would meet your definition of affordable, maximum rent currently $1,372, and at least 360 would rent today at $550, so a person earning $22,000 could move out of their parents' basement or a shelter. 10,000 new units and 360 families get almost rent geared to income housing. A start, but you're emptying the ocean with a spoon. You're creating an entity that will cost $1.6 million over 2 years for 360 RGI units and about 3,200 units for about 3,200 families with good-paying jobs will be able to live in Toronto. A laudable Band-Aid for a gut wound. I am a very fortunate person because I live in a 2-bedroom unit in a co-op. I pay market rent that is less than the CMHC average. We have over 200 units, and half my neighbors pay an RGI rate. I don't know which ones, because their units are no different. Not cheaper finishes, not smaller square footage, not more limited access to our gym and amenities. We have the most up-to-date energy-saving lights, toilets, etc. Our market rents are low because we are not paying an owner who takes this cut. The families paying RGI do not live in a depressed building, creating depressed people. Co-ops, by their very nature, allow for more than just affordable housing. They allow for the building of community. Co-ops have resident boards that govern them, and all members, and yes, we are members, not just residents, have final say on rules and on budgets. Members are expected to engage with members. If we decide if someone is to be evicted, we decide if someone is to be evicted. Are they perfect? No. They are not intentional communities or communes. Some people treat them as a place to live with lower rent and nothing more. We need more co-ops. We were building co-ops created through partnerships with unions and churches until the Harris years. There was some talk of co-ops in the last Ontario budget. Somehow, I guess, that's not at the top of this government's agenda. This proposal is not bad, but it's second or third best. Yes, maintain title. Create TO should retain title to the land. Appreciation of land value should remain in the city's hands. You want the cooperation of nonprofits and co-ops, but engage them not as purchasers, but as partners. Work as closely as possible with Premier Ford's government. Give it the old college boys try, and the old boys college try, and there's a federal election coming. Try to get an agreement with Trudeau's government, or at least an election promise. We must start building co-ops again. We cannot continue to attach small RGI units counts to projects. Yes, yay for wanting more rentals, yay for wanting rentals that some people can afford, and a very tiny yay for wanting to add over 300 RGI units to help a tiny fraction of the almost 100,000 active applicants for social housing and others. I will do my part to encourage the federal and provincial governments to build affordable housing. You must do yours.
Thank you. I gave you an extra 15 seconds because you're a constituent of mine. Any questions of the deputant? No, seeing none? Thank you very much.
Welcome. See you around.
Keith Johnston.
Good morning and thank you. My name is Keith Johnstone. I'm a family doctor from Toronto, and I'm here today on behalf of Health Providers Against Poverty and also as part of the broader Shelter and Housing Justice Network here today. Thank you for allowing me to speak. As healthcare providers, we know that housing is a key social determinant of health. Life expectancy for people living in shelters is a great deal shorter than that of the general population, 13 years for men and 8 for women. In Toronto alone, we know of 4 homeless individuals who have died since the beginning of this year. For each of these people, there are countless more struggling with homelessness who we see in our clinics, emergency rooms, and hospital wards. The toll on their health is undeniable, unjust, and expensive to address. Lack of affordable housing has reached a critical point in this city. The social housing waiting list is already enormous and continues to increase. The number of people accessing emergency shelters is also increasing significantly year to year. This past Monday alone, I believe about 8,000 people accessed the shelter system. While we agree with Mayor Tory that improving supports for people with mental health and addictions issues should be part of an overall strategy to address the housing crisis, we also want to point out that homelessness and inadequate housing are direct contributors to these very issues. It's difficult to imagine our patients addressing their mental health challenges without the stability and safety that stable housing provides. We think that stable housing should be considered a first priority in any initiative to improve mental health. We ask that the city take steps to address the lack of housing with a plan that supports deeply affordable housing options. In terms of the Housing Now initiative being discussed today, our colleagues here today have identified many areas of weakness that we encourage you to consider. Additionally, we ask that permanent shelter bed spaces be expanded so that the city is able to consistently meet its own criterion of having 90% or less occupancy. All facilities should be low barrier and operated with a harm reduction perspective so that we're able to support people also impacted by the opioid crisis. Finally, we want to add our voice to those calling for a state of emergency on Toronto's homelessness situation. Last year, we released a report showing that conditions at winter respite centers and 24-hour drop-ins were not meeting the city's own standards or those of the United Nations for emergency situations. This is not the worst of it. Many others are turned away from these places due to overcapacity, putting them in even riskier conditions in sub-zero temperatures. The homelessness crisis in our city is undoubtedly causing serious harm and is a public health threat. From our perspective, this is nothing short of a state of emergency.
Thank you.
Thank you again for allowing me to speak.
Great. Questions of the deputy? Thank you, sir. Patricia O'Connell, Executive Director of Sistering. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Mayor, I was here last year many times, and I sat across from you and begged you for shelter, more shelter beds. I think at this point, staff can correct me, but I think you have about 100 shelter beds. The Davenport opened Monday, and the seniors one opened before Christmas. The city has not responded, as you know, to the demand for shelter. We have respite centers. They are proving to be problematic, as you know. People are dying in the street. Our Crystal died 2 weeks ago. Hung Vo died in that garbage truck accident. There's been a homeless man die. And what I don't understand is why there hasn't been an uproar here at City Hall. From you, Mr. Mayor, why haven't you got the feds to the table? Why haven't you got the province to the table? There was not one peep out of City Hall that I could hear when our people died. Both Crystal and Hung are longtime users of the shelter system, and they died on the bloody street. Crystal was 34 years old, a woman with incredible compassion and kindness and grace, and had difficulties, and nobody stepping up for her. Last year I was here as a newcomer. This year I'm here with bloody despair in my heart because nobody's doing anything. I still can't sleep at night. I see Crystal's face every night when I put my head down. This is not an exaggeration. This was a wonderful woman. Mourned, we had a memorial. She was mourned by 150 people came to Sistering. Residents of our Dovercourt community, businesses that got to know her because she was on the street, and nobody here is doing anything. The city's answer to this is to create a quality assurance division. You've got a whole division now that is going around to Sistering, to other places. They measure the temperature, they count our toilets, they count our sinks. This started last spring. once a week, once a week, once a week. Recently, it's every 2 weeks. My toilet numbers don't change, my sink numbers don't change, my temperature maybe varies by 1 or 2 degrees. I have soap in the bathrooms, I have toilet paper. Take that money and do something with it. Fix the bloody elevator at Women's Res. It's been broken for 3 years. We have seniors sleeping on our floor that can't get into a shelter because they're not accessible. Women's Res does a wonderful job with sistering women, but they can't get there because they can't get to a bed. It's so wrong. The priorities are wrong. You've got to do something. I'm here again begging that this council do something. You have no heart anymore. This city used to have a heart. It treated people well. It looked after people. In the last several years, I don't see it, and it's...
Yep. Thank you, ma'am.
My time's up.
You're over time, but thank you very much. There's a question from Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you. Are you aware that somewhere in the vicinity of 40% of those in our various shelters are asylum seekers or refugee applicants?
Yes.
And I guess you also know that it's clear in our Constitution that immigration, refugee status, asylum seeking is federal jurisdiction. I'm wondering whether you've taken this message to federal counterparts to come to the table and pay their fair share.
Is that your job or mine? It's your job to get the feds to the table. It's not my job.
Well,
all right.
I would respond to that. I'm very disappointed
Counselor,
in what you're saying
Counselor.
because it's all our responsibility to
Please.
advocate.
The people
for you to
behind
just
me
say,
and me have been banging for years, and where are you?
where are you? You should be talking to the federal government and join us in the conversation.
To Councillor Pasternak.
Sorry, madam.
To your point,
Madam.
hang on,
No,
I'm going
I'm
to answer
just-
the question.
I'll let you answer the
I have a
question.
meeting this week
Madam.
with our MP about this very issue. She is coming to Sistering, and we're talking about not asylum seekers, we're talking about housing and shelter.
So, we've been really good so far up until now, which is great. The meeting's been moving along really well. Couple of reminders, Councillor, you know, ask a question through me. You speak to the chair, and as long as we do that, things
I'm
will
happy
work
to
well.
speak to you, Mr. Menzel Del... Okay.
Fair enough.
I know Mr.
The other
Mayor.
thing is the clapping, and it's great. I know you're enthusiastic, but we've been doing so well up until now. So if we can just carry on, we can all work our way through this, okay? So you wanted to say something in response to Councillor Pasternak?
I said it. I said I have a meeting with our federal MP this week to talk about the national housing strategy, to talk about how the feds can help Sistering and the people behind me.
Right.
But
okay.
I think, Mr. Chair, that's your job.
Thank you. Further, Councillor Bailão.
Thank you, Patricia, thank you. And thank you and everybody at Sistering for what you do. I live around the corner, and I see how much beyond what you are supposed to do, and I know that everybody's trying their best to serve as many people as possible and to keep them warm, not only in temperature, but in their hearts as well, so thank you. We've heard from people saying, shelter's not the solution, and I agree. I very often say if we're building shelters, we're failing. We understand that we need the housing and supportive housing, but even, this supportive housing and this housing, it's going to take time to build. We need that bridge. We need that little bridge now because we have this crisis in our hands, and we need that little bridge. What tools do we need? Like the kind of women that you're serving. How can we? Is it the supportive services? Is it housing allowances for those people? What is some of the tools that we can talk about that we can either advocate or put through the city?
Okay. There's a couple of short-term things, and I have to say, some of you were here last year when former Councillor Mahevik did his little staircase, starting with drop-in shelters, transitional housing, supportive housing. I totally support what he was saying. Housing allowances that we've received this year have helped us housed 60 women that were sleeping on the floor at
So
System.
they've been successful? Is that a tool that
Yeah.
you?
And that was through the housing allowances that we got through the city from the province, I think from the province. One of the things that we've learned since Crystal's death, we knew this, but it's very apparent, is that we have to have at least a couple of small housing units, east and west, for women with really significant complex health problems. So someone like Crystal and a number of the women that we serve cannot be adequately served in the shelter system because of their health issues, and they come to Sistering because we have a higher tolerance for some of the issues. We need a small, maybe 8-bedroom house in the west and one in the east for people with the most complex needs, where we can they can be appropriately staffed, they can have display the behaviors that they display in their own room until they can de-escalate, that they can be kept safe, warm, and perhaps get some help for their problems. These are the people that the big system does not serve. Housing doesn't serve, hospitals don't serve. Hospitals cannot deal with the women that we have with the complex needs that they have.
Thank you very much. Any further?
We'll continue the conversation.
Okay.
Any further questions? Quickly, Councillor.
I just heard you say you'd like a couple of houses to basically transition women from the shelter into rooms and then perhaps into more permanent housing. Is that what you're thinking about?
Well, the women I'm mentioning, I don't know whether they would ever get into, quote, market rent housing or affordable housing, but their needs cannot be met in the current system.
I see.
And if
So
we
very
had
high
that
needs.
kind of facility, Crystal would be alive.
And would you operate that? Do you have?
I would be thrilled to operate it.
Are there funds for the operation of such?
We have started our board actually is going to look at this tonight. We've been doing a tremendous amount of fundraising. We actually fundraised money this year to build 3 more showers at Sistering. No city money, no anybody money. Fundraising from our community because we had 1 shelter for 80 people or 1 shower for 80.
This would be to operate for the staff.
I'm sorry,
The
for
staffing model.
Yes.
You would be able to access that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Raina Slobodian? Hello.
Hi there.
Welcome.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for putting together the Housing Now initiative. But I am also someone here to say it's not enough. My name is Raina, and I'm a master's student at York University. And I'm doing my thesis on how news media uses language to further stigmatize people who are poor. So I do know that language has power. And so, Mr. Tory, by refusing to see homelessness as a state of emergency, you're letting people die. And I appreciate that you are here and you seem to be listening today, which I really appreciate. However, you visit shelters and then claim to know what the causes of homelessness are after just speaking to a few people. You also referenced the inaccurate and terribly framed point-in-time count report. And use this idea of mental illness as a major cause. But again, I hope that you were listening to the other deputies who were talking today. From the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, whose definition has been used by the Government of Canada, they state cause of homelessness to include individual and relational factors, broader population-based structural factors, and the failure of many public institutions to protect people from homelessness. So homelessness prevention must not only include interventions targeted at individuals, but broader structural reforms directed at addressing the drivers of homelessness. So this will include things like tainted drug supplies, colonial practices, rising rents, lack of enough safe and affordable housing, rent evictions, physical abuse, racism, gender and sexual orientation discrimination, among many other things as the causes of homelessness. So that's just to contextualize all of the factors. I'm also a Toronto Homeless Memorial volunteer, so I'm very angry and I'm sad. And I should not, along with my colleagues, have to be writing anyone's name down on that list every month, but we continue to do so. This needs to be called an emergency for what it is. And you have been mayor for years, and the homelessness crisis is at an all-time high. And it's getting worse because you don't seem to want to create any meaningful changes, and like people have said before, this drop in the bucket, these Band-Aid solutions. You can't tell Crystal Papineau and her family that it's not a crisis, or Hang Vo that it's not a crisis, or the countless others who have died violently that this isn't an emergency. Because they're dead, and that's the ultimate consequences of our apathy is death. Please do something more and do it now. Stop these preventable deaths. There's really no more excuses. So I don't understand how we can let our citizens die in Toronto year after year after year. It makes me ashamed to be a part of a city whose majority of politicians aren't doing everything in their power to take care of our people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions of the deputy? Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you very much for coming. I know it's a big deal to make a deputation if you haven't been here before, and expressing your views here. Where are the places that you can go to express those same views, because it's important that you do, to the provincial and federal governments? What are the places that, venues, however you do that? I'm really interested in how we're maximizing pressure on the other levels of government.
Okay, so outside of Toronto,
No,
how would I address Doug Ford about these issues? How would I-
outside of this Toronto Council, how do you interface with the caucus, the GTA caucus or the Toronto caucus for both of the governments? Have you gone up to Queen's Park? Have you been able to make a deputation somewhere? And
I have not.
Ideas?
What I have felt I've been able to do has been, I've been doing letter writing campaigns to both the province, to Lisa MacLeod, to the federal government. So for me, I think it would, if we're moving the pressure away from Toronto City Council and we're going, okay, what about federal and provincial, then I think it would be easier to have some way to make available what we can do and how we can visibly put pressure, other than having rallies and again, letters without really conveying our feelings of frustration.
And I missed that. Are you with an organization or you're?
I'm a master's student at York, and I'm with the Toronto Homeless Memorial.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that's in my, yeah, great.
Anybody else? No? All righty. Our next deputy is Greg Cook, Outreach Worker, Shelter and Housing Justice Network. Welcome.
Welcome. Earlier this week on Monday night, we know 1,089 people stayed in drop-ins, respite, places of worship, and warming centers in an effort to survive. 6,844 people stayed in shelter beds. This means thousands of Torontonians had to negotiate ID checks, long lines, arbitrary sleeping mat lotteries, being put on hold, taxi transfers, waiting lists to secure a small rectangle of heated space to themselves. Many more rode TTC buses all night, huddled in 24-hour Tim Hortons, crawled into sleeping bags beneath soaring bridges, and made impossible decisions between the cold street and a violent bed in an effort to get some sleep and not freeze. Amidst this instability, structural violence, and frigid temperatures are tens of thousands of acts of compassion and care. A shared sandwich, a valiant search for more warm clothes for a friend, a shoulder to cry on, grounding words amidst a panic attack, two friends carrying a third friend to a full respite center just in time for check-ins so they don't lose their mat. When you are down and out in Toronto, you need to look out for each other, because that's all you got. Sure, there are hardworking staff, but we are under-resourced. We can dress a wound or offer kind words, but we can't create 4 secure walls, privacy, and a locked door out of thin air. In a city that evicts its anti-eviction lawyers, we can't stretch $733 to cover a $1,200 rent rate. No, make that $2,400 to cover first and last month's rent. A credit check. A society that prefers not to rent to Indigenous or Black residents. Housing is not affordable in Toronto. It gets worse each month. It destroys people and runs them over, literally. This is a crisis. We need shelters that don't exceed 90% capacity. We need housing that is rent geared to income built now. We need this executive committee to care. We need you to stop blaming a systemic housing crisis that kicks people to the curb on an individual's state of mental health. It's a new year. This is a new iteration of City Council after the recent elections. It would be an ideal moment in history to rally around an equitable, just, and compassionate vision for our city, a vision that is spelled out with bold policy and just funding decisions. Instead, we are offered housing now. More of the same, the status quo, a continuation of the kind of choices that have precipitated this catastrophe. Let me look at how this vision of the status quo has displaced thousands of our neighbors. From a recent ACORN report, in 2009, the city set a target of creating 1,000 new affordable rental homes per year, but has not met that target since Mayor Tory came into power. It looks likely that the city will miss this target by around 50% in 2018. Since 2014, the city should have built around 4,000 affordable rental homes, but it is on track to have built less than 1,500 by the end of this year. The Mayor and City's Council Affordable Housing Plan misses the mark.
Thank you. Questions? No? Thank you very much, sir. Yogi Acharya, Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. Welcome.
Thank you. People have talked about the deaths of Hang Vo, who was 58 years old, the death of Crystal Papineau, but there have been more than 2 deaths in the city, and as sad as it is, we've had to respond to them all. Tabitha Lewis was 30 years old. She died at the George Street Respite Center right around the time when Crystal Papineau died. There was another young Indigenous man who was found in an alleyway, also homeless, and there have been more, at least 2 more that we're hearing of further. Contrary to all evidence, there are some people from the Toronto Alliance claiming that things, and as does the mayor, that things are somehow better this year than they were last year, even though the number of deaths that we've seen in January are far higher. Close to 1,000 people are staying in the backup system of respite centers because the shelters are full. And when we talk about declaring a state of emergency in the city in order to address the crisis at the level that it does, we hear things like the Housing Now initiative being propped up by the mayor as a potential solution. But I think it's important to actually assess who the Housing Now initiative, based on what is reported today and what was presented today, what has already been reported and what was presented today will actually help. You're talking about creating 10,000 units. Of those 10,000 units, you're saying 6,300 will be market housing. That's ownership and rental. You're talking about 3,700 units that will be set up as 80% of average market rent. For a 1-bedroom apartment, according to CMHC, you're talking about over $1,000 a month. That's not affordable to those 10,000 people, about 10,000 people who are currently homeless in this city. They can't afford to pay that. It's not affordable to the 181,000 people who are on the waiting list for social housing in this city because they cannot afford your average or 80% of your average market rent. You have the opportunity with these 10,000 units to actually move the 10,000 people who are sleeping on the streets and who need special kind of housing, who need rent geared to income housing, into housing within a span of 3 to 4 years or however long it takes for you to build these units. But that's not what we're talking about. Your Tenant Services Committee put out a report where it said that in order to pay $1,200 in rent, you need a minimum income of $50,000 a year. The median income of people, individual people in the city is around $33,000 a year. So you're talking about these 3,700 units, not even the full 10,000, the 3,700 units helping people who are making an income of $45,000 or more. You're not talking about addressing the people who are in deep state of crisis now and who are dying on our streets as we speak. Councillor Bailao, in response to a comment made by Reverend Maggie Helbig, you're talking about 10% of those units being set aside at 40% of average market rent. You said $500 and said that's rent geared to income. That's not how rent geared to income works. You got to factor in the income portion before you call something rent geared to income. At $500, you're talking about somebody with an income of $18,000 a year. Do you know how much people on ODSP get paid? $13,000. People on social assistance get paid far less. So if you're talking about rent geared to income for those particular people, you need $300 for people on ODSP and $225 for somebody who's on social assistance, on welfare. And frankly, you were the chair of the Affordable Housing Committee for all this time.
You've gone over time.
Leave it there.
Thank you. Do we have questions of the deputy? Councillor Bailao, questions, please.
I'm just wondering if the deputy is aware that the limit to apply for example, one-bedroom rent geared to income is $44,000 of income. So somebody with a $44,000 income can apply for a one-bedroom rent geared to income apartment.
In your new housing now?
No, in social housing, rent geared to income. That's what we have. That's the rent geared to income system that we have right now. If you're under $44,000, you can apply for a rent geared
I know, but the rent is tagged to their income.
And with $44,000, what's 30% of your income? That's rent geared to income. That's what I was trying to say.
But that's not what your Housing Now report is offering.
Thank you very much. Any further questions of the deputy? Seeing none, thank you, sir.
And Mayor Tory, we've seen the ferocity of your advocacy when you allowed Ford to run roughshod over representation.
All right, our next oh, by the way, we're halfway through now. Deputants, we're at number 16, who is Mark Richardson, housingnowto.com. I'll hold your time there while you get.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
You should all have paper copies of this presentation as well to review.
There you go.
Okay, so councillors, first of all, Happy New Year. Welcome back. Congratulations for surviving the Hunger Games last year. And Mr. Murray, welcome to the Thunderdome. This presentation is an open data presentation on information we've scraped about these 11 Housing Now sites under the banner of housingnowto.com. I was on the planning review panel from 2015 to 2017, which was a public engagement process run by the city planner's office, which was representative of people from across the city. So it wasn't local neighborhood groups monopolizing the conversation. It was a representative group from across the city. In the 7 weeks since you announced these sites, we've gone to your open data site. We've also scraped stuff off your council site, your city planning site, the TTC, the Green Pea Parking, and the Eglinton Crosstown. We worked with folks at Map Your Property using the Evergreen calculator as well, and students from the Ryerson planning students. And we've created housingnowto.com. It's an interactive map. Which is public, it's global, anybody can use it. If you've got good high speed in here on your personal devices, you can interact with it. It's going to track the sites. We have photos from all the sites. We've visited all the sites. And we're going to track the progress of it. So there's the link. You can interact with it. We used Map Your Property to ask the questions, where is it and how is it zoned? So here's an example at 1250 Eglinton, which is a very interesting location. It's the intersection of $9 billion worth of transit infrastructure, and it's not particularly well zoned for the kind of density that is appropriate at that site. We also used the Evergreen Foundation's affordable housing calculator to work out, does it pencil and is it feasible on some of these sites. We came up with our own numbers. They don't match your city's numbers, so for the rest of the presentation, we're just going to use the city's numbers because I'm not going to argue about numbers. People have already mentioned that these units that you're creating are only really housing lottery units. You may create about 300 other units. What does a housing lottery look like? We've done a couple already in Regent Park this year, 962 for a one-bedroom, 114 for a two-bedroom, and a two-bedroom is running about 700 square feet. Mayor has said that he's vowing he won't waver on 40,000 over 12 years. We've only did 1,300 in in 2017, I think about 1,500 in 2018. This is the math you need to be doing. You need to be doing about 3,300 per year. You need to be doing housing now every year. Lots of people coming. We've had the public notice in the past. There will be no miracles. Failure is not an option. You don't have a perfect set of tools. You have to make this fit into the hole made for this using nothing but this. There's some information here on Aquavista and Regent Park, what you've actually delivered. We've also got the grid, which is better than any of the charts that are in your staff report that talk about the actual units you're delivering on these sites, the kinds of densities that are required. I'm not going to take any more time. My recommendations are at the back. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any questions of the deputant? Councillor Ainsley?
Could you explain, sorry, Mr. Richardson, earlier in your presentation, you made a reference to data scraping and the Eglinton Crosstown site. Could you explain a bit about that?
So when we were putting the system together, we had pulled stuff from your open data site, but there isn't a lot of planning-related data on your open data site. There's some zoning information. There's the ward boundaries for the new 25 wards. But in a lot of cases, when we went to get into the Open Doors program, we had to go back and scrape data out of the TMIS, the clerk's system. We had to scrape site information out of the Eglinton Crosstown sites. We had to scrape information out of Create TO because your data is all in silos. Nobody's really consolidating it effectively. So we've done that task. On these 11 sites, we've consolidated this data. We've run it past smart people who are engaged in these processes, and we've come up with a free tool anybody in the city can use to interact with these sites and track the progress of these sites. Are you making your numbers? How fast are you keeping up with your calendar?
Okay. And then I believe we have a chart here that was distributed as well. Yep. I believe that's...
And that's posted on our website and our Twitter handle. If anybody has any questions about specific sites, I'm happy to answer any of those questions.
Could you explain a little bit about, you have one column, so it's mostly in red, then there's another one, local NIMBY history, it's in red, yellow, and green?
Yeah, so the two columns, heights requested in rezoning of your 11 sites. Mr. Lintern may be able to correct this, but right now there's only 2 sites that Create TO has actually started any process to rezone. So those are the 2 sites in Mr. Min Wong's ward, which are the Don Mills Crossing. You're looking to put almost half of your affordable housing units in there, or about a quarter, at really high densities. You're up to 52 floors. Site right next door to them went to the OMB, took almost 10 years, and they were only at 30 floors. The local NIMBY history reflects the reality. Some neighborhoods are more welcoming than others. So the 2 sites that we rate as the highest, not in my backyard sites, are in Councillor Cole's ward, Councillor Matlow's ward. They're in Forest Hill area. One is at the Eglinton Crosstown, where it meets the Vaughan Extension. And then the other one is at 140 Merton, which is just north of Mount Pleasant Cemetery. You guys made that a heritage site in 2017, a 2-story commercial building you designated as heritage. So you're putting roadblocks in front of yourself, which really makes no sense.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Let's see. Andrea Budgie, Humphrey Chaplain, Trinity College.
Well, I'm here in my capacity as the chair of the Poverty Reduction Subcommittee of the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. I concur with the previous speakers about the shortcomings in scope and timing of the initiative, which should probably be called Housing Really, Really Soon. And with their insistence that you can't talk about this initiative about affordable housing in isolation from the full spectrum of needs. The need to deal with upstream contributors to homelessness, renovictions, discrimination, shortfall, and other supports. To provide emergency, low barrier, regular shelter, transitional and supportive housing, rent geared to income, all of that. Of course, the city cannot do all this alone. We recognize that. And I know that you're embarking on conversations with other levels of government, and I hope that those conversations will be open and transparent and public and not in a back room somewhere. There is still more the city can do. particularly in terms of revenue generation. And I know it's not popular to talk about taxes, but we need to get serious about looking at and comparing ourselves with other places that do this better, and some of them are not so far away. We need to support tenants and to regulate types of development. Now, I listened to the mayor on Monday, his interview with Matt Galloway, and I understand that you are operating from a place of compassion for the people you were talking to and listening to. And I know that there are councillors who work extremely hard to address the needs of their constituents who live with the effects of poverty and unstable housing. We are all hobbled in policy, in planning, in service delivery, and in revenue generation by a rhetoric which puts our most vulnerable citizens consistently in the third person, as the homeless population, as ODSP recipients, as the mentally ill, and although they're not our citizens yet, asylum seekers. Always the other, a problem to be solved, ideally a problem to be made to go away. Our public discourse about issues of poverty and housing needs to be carefully, thoughtfully, intentionally shifted over the long term into the first-person plural. Some of us live on the street. Some of us are in danger of eviction. Some of us are hungry and freezing. Some of us struggle with mental health problems. And how can we make life better for all of us? What can we all do? How can we all contribute to make sure that all of us can live in sufficiency and dignity? I emphasize this, not just blue skying, but because it's real work. It's not superficial or irrelevant. How we shape our public discourse has an enormous potential to transform minds and hearts. And our civic leaders have a primary responsibility in moving this transformation forward in the most compassionate, creative, and loving way. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions of the deputy? Thank you very much, ma'am. Judith Penfold. Judith Penfold. Hello. Welcome.
Hello. I'm from the Parkdale Tenants Association, a grassroots organization working in the historically lower income rental housing neighborhood of South Parkdale. Many of us have lived in Parkdale for decades. We've seen a dramatic increase in the number of homeless people on our streets for the past few years. We know there have always been many different reasons for homelessness, but we believe market pricing of $1,800 for a one-bedroom apartment resulting from the housing shortage and lack of rent control on vacant units is the reason for the worsening homeless crisis in Parkdale. We see the consequences of the evictions following unfair rent increases every day as we go about our lives in our neighborhood. An elderly woman lives in a nest of boxes and ragged blankets just off the corner of Queen Street and Close Avenue. In the McDonald's, homeless people ask us for our coffee cup stickers to get enough for a cup of coffee to warm themselves up. The lineups outside St. Francis Table at dinner time get longer every day. Our homeless in Parkdale do not see emails to come to meetings like this one. We, like other neighborhood groups, are here to make a plea for them. If you believe there is a housing crisis in our city, and it's hard to imagine anyone who has access to any kind of media not believing in it, then you must believe there is a homelessness crisis too. We see a state of emergency in our neighborhood, and it cannot be the only one. We ask for a homelessness state of emergency to be declared now and priority given in the future to those suffering most as the city plans for affordable housing. Housing is a human right and must be available to everyone.
Francis Sedgwick? She's not here. You did.
I'm sorry, I was speaking for both of our co-chairs, myself and Francis.
Thank you. Paul Downing?
morning. So my name is Paul Dowling. I'm the chair of the Human Rights Working Group of the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness. I want to begin by congratulating staff on the excuse me, comprehensive report, which touches on a wide range of tools and mechanisms to achieve affordable housing, beginning with making city-owned lands available for housing. I think all of us at the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness and the Human Rights Working Group are very pleased to see the city taking this step in the direction of achieving housing as a right for all people in Toronto. We all know that deeply affordable and supportive housing are the solution to the crisis of homelessness in our city. The Housing Now initiative will contribute to that much-needed solution. Unfortunately, as you've heard from other people, the standard that's being set by this Housing Now initiative is not ambitious enough. I came prepared to sort of talk a little bit about the numbers and the fact that you're guaranteeing as part of this that about 360 or so units would be available at a level of rent that people who are homeless can afford. You've heard all that, so I'm not going to repeat all that. But what I am going to talk a little bit about is about some of the other initiatives that are identified in the report. Very pleased to see in the staff report this morning that staff are going to be bringing forward a report, a recommendation to council on inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning, as you know, is a mechanism by which municipalities can require that all new significant housing developments include a proportion of affordable housing. That's really good. It's really good that that's going to be coming forward. I think we really need that. And what you're doing now with these city-owned lands is setting an example and setting a standard that will then be, you can then apply to all other developments. So when another developer comes forward with sites similar to those which you now own and which you are putting forward, those sites can be made available and can include affordable housing as well. My concern, and I think the concern of many of us here, is you're setting too low a bar. You're setting a bar that's so low that, as people have said, the homeless people on the street will continue to be homeless for years and decades into the future. The waiting list for subsidized housing, Councillor Bailao, you talked about the standard by which people can get on the waiting list for subsidized housing. And as you know, there are 100,000 households on that waiting list. And that list is growing at a rate of about 2,000 households per quarter. So to turn the curve on that and to begin to actually reduce the number of people who are waiting for affordable housing and to reduce the number of people who are homeless and on the street requires all of us, not only the city, but all the developers and people who are developing housing, to do their share to ensure that affordable housing is available. You have the opportunity to set an example, to set a standard that you can then call on others to meet. And I encourage you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we heard earlier from HouseLink that there are a lot of properties that nonprofit housing providers own. And obviously, they're one-purpose properties, and that's to provide usually supportive housing of some kind to vulnerable populations. Has there ever been, I want to call it a summit or somebody pulling together all of the housing providers that own that land to look at what some of the redevelopment potential would be in getting more floors and adding on the sites that we currently have or combining with others? Kind of like what we're doing here, but we don't own all those properties.
That's a really good idea. I think that whether it's supportive housing providers or other housing providers, including TCHC, to look at all of their properties and say, are there ways in which we can intensify those properties to ensure that they provide more housing? Obviously, that requires money, so if the city is prepared to put up some money for both that exploration and for that redevelopment, that would be a great thing to do.
So one of the requests in the recommendations is to have some money for nonprofits, I guess, really to look at these 11 sites and see how they could be involved. Mm-hmm. But perhaps we should also have some money for somebody to convene that exercise to really look at all the properties that are owned and if they're being maximized and have a development plan or redevelopment plan, particularly in light of the aging population in some of the housing providers.
I think that's a really good idea, but I think that before we start saying, okay, what could be done and what's the potential in terms of intensification, there needs to be some expectation that the funds will be there to achieve.
Oh, absolutely. That if we're thinking, I hear you, So if we're considering supportive housing as an important part of our housing continuum, which we're hearing today, these are mostly rental, and then we're looking at how to involve nonprofit providers, which could be co-ops, it could be supportive housing on these sites. But a single exercise that would actually look at the property values, the properties that are currently held by nonprofit boards generally, and who are trying to cope in this environment with the pressures, may be a good next step. And obviously, to find some of that funding would be part of the job.
I agree, and I think that you mentioned that the Housing Now initiative includes some money to help nonprofit providers, nonprofit and co-op providers participate in the program.
Right.
I think that that's a good thing. I don't think it goes far enough. I think that there needs to be an opportunity to ensure that a significant proportion of the housing that's developed on these publicly owned lands continues to be available for affordable and supportive housing in perpetuity through nonprofit ownership.
Okay, thank you.
Luchik? I don't know if I got your name pronounced correctly.
I tell people when my parents came to Canada, they were having a sale on consonants, so they stocked up. But it's pronounced Lewicki.
Okay, thank you.
So my name is Mariana Lewicki, and I'm the president of the Park Vista Tenants Association. And I hope we can all agree that when affordable housing is increasingly out of the reach of the average citizen in Toronto, we risk turning a world-class city into a glittering enclave of inequality and shattered dreams. It means masses of workers converge in the city during the day to serve local needs and then disperse to make long commutes home or trek to towering local condos with sky-high rent or aging apartments where they have to fight their landlords to get repairs done. This isn't the Toronto I want, and I'm sure it's not the Toronto that you want. When I was young, Toronto held great opportunities for both house hunters and job hunters. My father, a Ukrainian immigrant who grew up on a farm, worked blue-collar jobs in Toronto and was able to achieve his Canadian dream of raising a family with 3 children and owning a mortgage-free home in the picturesque Humber Valley. A lot of things have changed since then. As the Housing Now background materials show, over the last decade, the cost of housing and residents housing choices have become increasingly restricted. Rental ownership housing costs have significantly outpaced wage increases. We often hear about the barriers to profitability for landlords. However, the large corporate landlord that operates the building I live in reported net operating income of $393 million in 2017 on operating revenue of close to $638 million for a net operating income margin of 61.6%. The motto on their latest annual report is solid gold record for 20 years. That doesn't sound like a landlord struggling to get by. We know we can't rely on the private entities to solve the housing crisis. They're in the business of making a profit, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. The Housing Now initiative is a terrific step forward, but I would encourage you to carefully look at the number and mix of affordable units. This is the city's chance to consider need over profit. This is our moment. Let's set the bar higher. Thank you, and I appreciate all the research, analysis, and long work days that city staff put into this report, and I look forward to seeing much-needed affordable housing get built. Thank you.
Thank you. No questions? Thank you, ma'am. Monica De Vera. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Monica, and I'm from the east end of the city. I'm here to share my personal concerns about housing affordability and my thoughts and questions on the report before you today. I'm worried about being priced out of Toronto. I am educated. I have a full-time job that I love, and right now I'm lucky because I have parents to live with and some time to save some money. I really love my parents, but I don't want to live with them forever. I also know that not every young adult in Toronto is lucky enough to live with their parents until they're ready to move out. We have a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis in our city. And Mayor Tory, I'm looking to you to be a leader and declare a state of emergency at City Council next week. It is your responsibility to do everything you can to take care of the people of Toronto. And this goes for all city councillors. While I'm glad that affordable housing is being discussed, I have questions and concerns about the recommendations in the report before you. First, you are investing hundreds of millions of dollars to possibly sell public property. And all of that to build affordable housing on only 1/3 of the land, building only 3,700 units. With over 180,000 people waiting for affordable housing today, why aren't you simply building our own affordable housing on our own property? I'm going to read a quote from Mayor Tory from his CBC interview this week. The first act of the new administration, 3,300 affordable housing units. By the way, people will say that it's not enough, and I agree with them. It's more than anyone else has done in one fell swoop in a long, long time. Mayor Tory, if you agree that it's not enough, and if it's on our land, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you using this to build more affordable housing? And while the land would be possibly sold forever, the affordable housing in this report is not required to be provided forever. What happens when the city has no more city property left to sell? How will my generation solve the affordable housing crisis then? This plan is passing the problem off to my generation. You're relying on selling off land, and we will be expected to solve our future housing pressures more creatively and without the sale of public land. There will be none left. This plan is short-sighted. There must be a better way. Last, 80% market rent is not affordable rent in our city. People like me, who don't make nearly as much money as a generation before us, and who don't have a family inheritance to turn to, need rent geared to income. That is affordable rent. To conclude, the housing and homeless crisis in the city requires bold action, and I'm looking to all of you to be bolder. Build more, make it ours forever, and make it truly affordable for the people in this city. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Thank you for coming today, Monica. I think it's important that you took the time, and we know that this is not easy, but these deputations will help inform our decisions. If we sell the land and most likely transfer it over into private hands, do you think the top priority of a private developer will be developing affordable housing or building profit?
Of course not. Their priority will be maximizing their profit.
Thank you.
Just wanted to check on a couple of things. Thanks for coming in this morning. First of all, you're aware of the fact that I think the vast majority of these parcels, as evidenced by what's said in the report, the actual proposal here to put out to the private and nonprofit sector is for 99-year leases and for 99-year affordability. So I'm sure you'd want to acknowledge that, because you'd suggested that the proposal was to sell off land and not have it as affordable for any period of time. The report actually doesn't say that. Would you acknowledge that?
Yeah, I acknowledge the 99 years, but I don't know if the housing crisis will be solved in 99 years. I don't think I'll be alive.
But the land will still come, well, you'll acknowledge that the proposal then is if the lease is up, the land comes back and is still owned by the city. That's the idea of the lease. It lasts 99 years. I don't know if we'll be here, but maybe we can always hope. I don't mean here in City Hall, I mean just alive. But I can assure you I won't be at City Hall. That'll be a source of great cheer to many. But But in 99 years, the land would come back to the city. But that's what the report says.
Yes, I acknowledge that the report says that if it's leased, it'll come back to us in 99 years. But I also want to acknowledge that selling is an option in the report. And if you're going to lease, why not? Why doesn't the plan say just lease?
Yeah, and I'll be happy that you should come back and make another deputation if in fact there's recommendations.
Yeah, I'll be
to sell,
back.
But at the moment, there is no such recommendation. The second thing, you talk about, why aren't we building more units? I assume you'd also acknowledge that on these 11 parcels that are in all different parts of the city in different kinds of neighborhoods, that we have to build a development there, that they say we collectively, the city, that's compatible with those neighborhoods. So you can't just say, well, we're going to put a 50-story building there, because I agree the need is there, and a 50-story building of which a huge number were affordable would be helpful, but we're going to be limited to some extent even on these pieces of land that we own by the fact they're in neighborhoods, and therefore the development, consistent with other city planning, has to be compatible, which is why you do get some upside in terms of whatever the number is of units in total that you can build. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
So maybe it's just me not fully understanding, but even then, even if we do have to have some other units for other purposes or to actually sell at market, I don't think 1/3 is enough.
Okay, so that was the next question, but I'm not sure you understood the second one, which was that when you talked about the quantum in total, the 10,000 that would be built on the 11 parcels of land that will likely be leased, we're limited in terms of not making that 20,000 or 30,000 by the fact that the land is where it is and it is the size that it is, and therefore you can't just put an unlimited number of units there, as much as you might like to do that to help solve this problem.
Okay.
Right? And then the second point was one you made, or final point, which is, I think you agree as well that we want to create mixed income communities here, so that when you talked about how we should have far more of these units, I guess it sits with us to adjust that percentage from what it is today, which is about 1/3 of the total. You have to do that within the context of, you'd agree, I think, making it viable for people to come in, nonprofit or private sector developers, and build these buildings. But you would agree with the concept of mixed income communities as opposed to making something all affordable, as it were, and creating a community that consists only of that.
I think that there would be a way to build communities where buildings are all affordable housing. I don't understand why community only has to be based on mixed income. Is that what, I don't.
No, that was the question, and you and I might have a different opinion on that, but I accept your answer, and I thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your question, Mayor.
Councillor Ainsley?
Thank you, through the chair. Monica, first of all, I want to thank you for coming in this morning. It's great to see an individual coming in. There's lots of people on this list associated with an organization, so it's great to see you coming in. I did want to ask you, I'm not going to ask you your age, but you seem similar age to our oldest son, and his biggest concern is about being able to afford to buy a place to live. And based on your presentation, what you hear and read in the report, do you think you'll ever be able to afford a home in Toronto?
No, I don't think I'll be able to afford a home in Toronto. In my deputation, I was speaking from the context of someone who wants to move out to rent.
Yeah, and I'm similar because our oldest son's still at home, and we just had a conversation the other night about him finishing university, and then, whether he's got tuition fee, debt, and then trying to get out and be able to afford a place to live or buy in Toronto. But you don't think at this point in your life, you see that as a huge hurdle?
Yeah, I really don't think I'll be able to ever own. And I'm okay with that. I just want there to be affordable housing for myself, my friends, my 2 younger brothers, and for the 180,000 people still waiting.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next is Joanna Moon. Welcome.
Good morning, Mayor Tory, councillors, and city staff. My name is Joanna Moon, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the Dale Ministries, a community organization and church in Parkdale that places at its core those who are often pushed to the margins. As Parkdale gentrifies, we have seen a sharp increase in the number of people of low income being evicted and their units being rented out for double the price. Many of the members of the Dale are facing the stress of being pushed out of places they have called home for many years, compounded with the bleak reality that there is nowhere affordable to go. Our colleagues at Parkdale Community Legal Services have done and are doing great work in fighting back against these evictions, which are often illegal. But now the legal clinic itself is being evicted. Many of the people in Parkdale have been on the wait list for subsidized social housing for a decade or more. Now, not only is subsidized housing a far-off dream, but the stock of rooming houses and relatively affordable apartments is decreasing at an alarming rate. When our friends are forced out of their homes, the only other option is the shelter system that, as you know, is overwhelmed. The only emergency shelter in Parkdale is a women's respite center on Cowan Avenue, which is overcrowded with cots on the floor and no showers. The next closest option is one of the windowless sprung structures in Liberty Village, which feels far more like a warehouse for humans than a home. We've been told by multiple people that the other respite center in the Queen Elizabeth building in the exhibition grounds is a pretty dismal place to be, and that food rations are totally insufficient. While these temporary shelters have been necessary this winter and last, they are not a long-term solution, as you know. They are far from dignified and give our friends the impression that they are a problem to be dealt with rather than the inherently precious people that they are. We are glad that affordable housing has become a priority for this committee. And we are deeply concerned that the plans outlined in the Housing Now initiative will not benefit those in most desperate need of affordable housing. We urge you to require that the housing developed on the 11 designated properties be truly affordable, with at least 50% being rent geared to income units. These 11 sites must include supportive housing, as has been mentioned many times this morning, and housing for people exiting homelessness. At least 10% of these units must be dedicated to Indigenous housing providers.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions of the deputant? Seeing none, thank you for coming. Gordy Dent, Executive Director, Federation of Metro Tenants.
Hi, thank you for having me today. I'm from the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations. We're a tenants' rights agency. We help service about 80,000 people a year, and about 50,000 of those are direct kind of face-to-face service. So we deal with housing all the time. We deal with people that are in crisis, looking for housing all the time. To understand our kind of comments on the report, you have to understand how the FMTA sees housing. We don't see it as a commodity. You're not trading in cookies. We see it as infrastructure, like pipes, schools, roads, hospitals. In that light, I think for us, when I looked at this, and I've been thinking around this stuff for years, we feel this is a great 2009 housing plan. It's got units in the thousands. It's got significant affordable development targets. The development is locked into 99-year leases. That's really great. And the city's not just kind of passing the buck onto the feds and the province. They're actually trying to activate land sites that they have. These are all good things. Credit's given where it's due. We've been calling for this for years, so we really like to see this. Why do we feel it's lacking? Why do we feel that you're getting this kind of pushback, being like it's not enough? The reason why that is because we're currently in a brutal crisis. I did see the mayor speak at CMHC talking about when he was canvassing for their election, housing was the #1 issue. And if you spend a day on our tenant hotline, you live and breathe that every day. You get calls all the time, people suffering and misery. We've got hundreds of people dying on the streets. Shelters are at max capacity. The wait list first broke the record years ago as tragedy and has been breaking the record every month as farce ever since. It's become a joke. So in this light, For almost every development, what we often ask is, can someone on a CPP pension afford the units that are being developed? Can someone on OW afford the units that are being developed? 80% AMR will run you about $800 a month, which what we used to call back in 2009, slightly expensive apartment, but is now considered to be rock bottom affordable. 3,000 units are going to open, and they're going to open hopefully in 4 years for $800. And is that going to be enough? It's hard for us to think so. It's hard for us to think that when somebody calls and they're on OW, I got an email in my inbox from some guy saying, I got OW and I need a boarding home, where can I find something? And the reality is I send him to a housing help center, and I know that he's probably not going to find anything. He's going to be stuck in the shelters for years. So when these units open in 4 years, how are our shelters going to look in that time? How many more people are going to be dead in that time? What's the wait list going to be like? So we come to you today kind of trying to live in two realities. In one reality, we know that the city hasn't really done a lot in the last 10 years around affordable housing development. So we think it's good that you're working on the issue. But we also live in the other reality, the reality where people are struggling, they're suffering, they're dying on the streets, and they need something now. So we urge you to look at deep affordability for these units, as much affordability as you can get. And as we hope this is an annual thing, not a kind of a one-shot 6,000 rental unit kind of project. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cressy, had questions? Anyone else? Councillor Fletcher?
Yeah, so Jordy, I hear you on the one point related to the deepening of affordability for the RGI units. I have a question related to, so within the proposal, it also calls for 3,800 purpose-built market rental units. So from the Federation, the province recently changed the rent control legislation, did they not?
Yeah.
So just so I understand, then these 3,800 market rental units would not have rent control apply to them based on the provincial legislation?
That's correct, yeah.
So if we wanted those market rental units, so I hear you on the deepening of affordability, but if we want the market rental units to have rental protections, we probably as a city have to create our own business terms to include rental protection.
This is kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of like planning, application kind of contracts. Not really our expertise, but I believe the city does have the power to do that, yeah.
But
it does have the power to lock in certain rents at a certain level.
But so not to take you out of your comfort level and area of expertise, one of the issues you're dealing with as the Federation is with rent control legislation now gone, unless the city intervenes, those rents would not be protected.
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
And look, protection for a $3,000 a month rental unit, it's not really going to be that big of a priority for us because no one's going to be able to afford that unit anyways. Again, you need units that people can afford.
Yeah.
Almost all the housing that was developed in the city of Toronto in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s was done because veterans came back from the war, found there were no housing, and they needed it, so the government built it. So I think, again, yeah, we've got to do this kind of grand scale building again.
Okay. Thanks, Joe.
Councillor Fletcher?
Yes, just wearing that hat of dealing with the tenants pieces, following up on Councillor Cressy, if the city was to look at a policy which would maintain the high but affordable for some rents within the rent control continuum, would that be something we should be looking at for the units that would be built, all the market units on the site?
Possible. Look,
Just
30.
a policy. It's a policy.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. And how about you're finding Airbnb? Are you finding that there are renovictions because people are now moving their apartments out to Airbnb, and that's part of contributing to the housing crisis that you're finding for renters at Federation of Metro?
We get a steady trickle every week of people, getting an N12. The landlord says they're moving in, and then they find their apartment on Airbnb later on. Absolutely. The provincial government is currently doing a consultation on adding supply. The easiest, quickest, no-cost thing that they can do is implement the City of Toronto policy that would bring 6,500 units back on the market.
There's 6,500 units, you're telling me, that are...
Full units that have been taken off. These are mostly like secondary suite condos, yeah. They're off the market. They're not deeply affordable, but again, it would just be a good, quick, no-cost injection of rental stock right away.
And one of the things that you help and supervise are tenant groups that are going to the Landlord and Tenant Board in order to fight increased rents based on, which are renovations that are quite extravagant in order to release that or re-rent that at a much higher rate.
Yeah.
And their city currently has a program to assist. Is that robust enough to assist the level of interest in organizing at the building level to go to the Landlord and Tenant Board?
Well, with my funder in the audience, I don't know if it's appropriate for me to say whether we've got enough money. What I will say is we just ran our stats on this stuff on both our hotline and our outreach team, and the numbers are higher than they've ever been. Like, we are getting, again, a skyrocketing number of Aggie applications, and our staffing stayed the same, so we're doing the best we can.
And do you let people know how they can go and make an application to get a grant to go to the Landlord Tenant Board?
Yep, we helped 100 people get grants last year, and I'm happy to say, again, I just ran our stats. City invests a couple $100,000 in tenant defense through that program this year. That program saved $4 million for tenants and rents last year.
Pardon? The tenant?
Tenant Defense Fund and the work that we did helped save $4 million in rents for tenants last year.
I mean, rent increases.
That's your last question.
Thank you.
Councillor Wong
That's
Tam.
amazing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. With respect to the 11 properties that are being allocated through a market offering process, and the language is that with a priority of retaining public ownership through long-term leases, is your understanding that this is a priority only, but not necessarily a requirement as outlined in the report?
I believe that's what the wording was. We've talked with a number of advocates, and they're very concerned about that language. Yeah, it just says, encourage and not require, yeah.
Okay. And because we're not requiring it, is the concern also from your organization and the people that you represent here that we're not going out to the market strong enough and visionary enough with some conditions that stipulate that we need more of this, which is deeply affordable housing with supportive and transitional housing built in, as opposed to just encouraging everyone to have a conversation and put back a proposal?
I think our big concern is a repeat of what I think was the Build Toronto program, which was an agreement in 2010 that said in 5 years the program was going to build 1,250 units. What it actually built was 12. So our concern is that the targets, which are good targets, might not be met. And look, I've got my own personal opinions of how you get there, but I understand the city's a big beast and I'm not in charge. How you get there is ultimately up to you, but I think what I really am trying to stress here is if you sit on our hotline, if you talk to the people going through this, the stress has been escalating. You need units. You need places for people to stay and live and contribute to the city.
And so would it be fair to say that based on the market offering process as outlined, let's just call it the procurement process, is that we could end up as the city, as taxpayers, subsidizing private home ownership through public lands based on the program that is set forward with us right now in the report without any amendments?
Again, that is a possibility. How it practically plays out, I don't know. But again, we've seen this before. We've seen, again, a great target, a solid target, just not get met. So, I leave it to you folks to figure out the odds that that's going to happen again. But if there is odds, we'd ask you to close that loophole. And again, we need these units, and we hope that you're going to be able to develop them.
Okay, thank you.
Righty. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there.
Thank you for being here. Could I just ask you a question? You said you had your own views as to how we might get to the target, and I'd actually be interested in hearing a short summary of that, and so that we could then pursue that perhaps and just understand what
with a couple of my bosses in the back, I'll decline. But what I will say is, there's a variety of ways you can build units. You can try to ensure that some of the stock that's offline, there's apparently about 100,000 vacant units in the city of Toronto, according to census data. You can try a vacant unit tax to bring them on. You can build units. I know not a lot of people like to think of the city as a brick and mortar builder, but I saw the Swedish public housing provider visited Toronto last year. They're not a social housing provider, they're a public housing provider, so they build market rent units. They're building 14,000 units this year in Stockholm. So this is another option. You can incentivize tax rates. So you can say, look, if you want to build rental here, we'll give you a 30% reduction in your taxes for 5 years if you build it here. There's a variety of different options. And again, I think a number of groups have asked you to look at this as a crisis. And they're not asking you to look at it as a crisis because they're concerned it will become a crisis. They're living this stuff. They are watching people die on the streets. I used to work in the shelter system in Vancouver. I know what it's like to go up and check on someone and they're dead. I know what it's like to find out that someone that you've been working with for 5 years that has severe mental health issues dies under a bridge. This is the scenario people are living every day here. And they're begging you to, again, get all hands on deck and build some stuff for that reason.
I'm sure, just one other question, you'd acknowledge that actually what this program is, beyond the component of the public land, is using the other tools, because it's specifically referred to in the report, as needed, depending on what proposals come back, in respect of development charges, in respect of taxes, to do precisely that, to incent people. And I, for one, I mean, will just tell you that I'm not going to be that interested in proposals that come back that fall way short of where we need to be in terms of if we're putting in the public land and this money. So that's what we're doing, using those very tools you just talked about. We're not building them ourselves, I concede that point, but we are using those tools to incent others to build those and requiring them to have a component, and there's been many arguments made here today about that component not being big enough, so we'll have to take a look at that. That's why we have these deputations. But you would acknowledge that's what we're doing, is using those tools to incent people to come in and build units.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the tools that I've mentioned, yeah, are in the report and they are being activated. I think what I hear in meetings, I go to dozens of network meetings every 3 months, and what I think the perception out there, and I'll leave you to think on this, is that it's a crisis, people are dying in the streets, and the city's not really acting that way. The city's kind of like, oh, hopefully we can build stuff, not really being like, moms and daughters and dads are all dying. They're not finding a place to be. They're fleeing the city. The low-income population of the city has, I think, been halved. And a quick little note, I was down in Cuba for my holiday vacation. My dad works down there. I've got some family friends there, and I told them 100 people died in Toronto last year. They're shocked. A poor developing nation is shocked that we had 100 people die on our streets. That was a little bit eye-opening to me, because you don't really expect to see that when you think of Toronto. You think of world-class city. So again, I think that's why everyone here has this kind of crisis mode, all hands on deck feeling.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. In the morning we're here, I think you were the only one to mention CPP in passing. Now, it's always been my view that long-term senior supportive housing, really, if you connect all the dots, you should really look at pension reform. Were you going in that direction, where we really have to work with our federal counterparts to do pension reform so there's more at the end of a working career to afford market or even below market housing?
Again, you're kind of veering out of my expertise. I think it's a valid point, and if you want to work on that, that's great. I know there's a variety of people that deal with social assistance and just income equality. My kind of area of expertise is the supply side of housing. So again, good initiative, not really something that I deal with a lot.
Okay, fair enough. Secondly, you're one of the only deputies to really focus on some of the inherent problems of people who come into the shelters: mental health, substance abuse, family breakup, bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy, loss of business, whatever, foreclosure on a home. Are we really talking about a housing issue, or are we talking about social policy, where we should be putting massive investments into mental well-being, substance abuse, counseling, those kinds of social services on the preventative side?
Look, there's no reason why you can't do both. I mentioned the Swedish group that came here. I actually used to live in Norway. And in Norway, you'd have robust social services for mental health. And you had active building market policy in terms of the housing file. Government would just flat out build a bunch of units or make it very attractive to build them. And the other thing that they would do is they'd make it harder to build condo. When those Swedish folks came here and talked to developers in Toronto and said, what's your kind of rental housing portfolio like? They were kind of like, we make a lot more money in condo. And that's, again, as long as that's the case, as long as it's, hundreds of millions of short-term profit in condos versus, the same level of profit in a rental, but, long-term, kind of strategy, long-term investment, you're going to get more condo. And that's what we've had here. And really, again, the social policy element is very important, but the social policy element has been our housing policy. And that's why last year, Quebec, which is a different social housing policy, built 12,000 rental units. 12,000 last year. And this report, which is again a kind of a flagship, largest we've seen in decades, is going to build 6,000 or 7,500.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Lindsay Parsons, Toronto, sorry.
Sir, can I just move that we, because it's now 25 after.
Yeah.
We normally break at 12:30.
Yes.
So I'd like to move that we hear, I understand, according to my list, we have 2 deputants left. I don't know if it's
No,
the same
we
on
have
yours.
more. I have a
You have
list.
more?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So you've added some more.
I just consulted, and I think that.
Fair enough,
back
and
here-
disregard it then, because I was going to say we hear the deputants before we broke for lunch, but that's fine.
Great.
Thank you.
So our last deputant before lunch will be Lindsay Parsons.
Hello, everyone. I'm here on behalf of the Toronto Shelter Network. Thank you today for the opportunity to speak about the Housing Now initiative. For those who are unfamiliar with the Toronto Shelter Network, we represent the majority of Toronto's shelters and respite service providers, including organizations such as Fred Victor, Homes First, Dixon Hall, Salvation Army, and many others. We support shelters to provide those experiencing homelessness with the highest quality of services and support, so that this important part of the housing continuum has the capacity to successfully transition people out of homelessness. This past year, emergency shelters and respite providers have been working tirelessly to provide enough beds for all those in need and to make sure that no one is turned away. By the spring of this year, an additional 1,000 beds will be added to the sector. This massive expansion of the shelter system cannot continue at this rate. The current shelter system is at capacity, and expanding it further puts at risk our clients and our staff. More importantly, investing in one part of the housing continuum to this extent, while not addressing the fact that shelter providers have no housing options to offer their clients, means that we will not make a dent in homelessness in the city. Therefore, we need to begin to direct substantial portions of the millions of dollars earmarked for increasing shelter beds towards other parts of our housing continuum. This includes investing in more transitional and supportive housing, affordable housing, and new deeply affordable housing. The Toronto Shelter Network works in partnership with the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness. We support its Zero TO campaign and the recommendations that they have made here today. The Housing Now initiative will bring us closer to our shared goals, and as such, we are here to support the city as you implement Housing Now and this important step towards developing deeply affordable housing options for people. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cressy had a question for you.
Just want to unpack that to make sure I understand. And thank you for being here, Lindsay. So the Toronto Shelter Network, do I understand correctly that the advocacy here is for the city to scale up its work related to transitional and supportive housing to provide a pathway out of the shelters, perhaps even to use shelter dollars to do so?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we need to focus more on where these people are going to go after shelters. We can't just keep pushing them into shelters.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Councillor Wong-Tam.
Yes, thank you very much. Are you aware that under this particular proposal, only 1/3 of these properties will be affordable by way of CMHC definition? So yes, you are aware of that. And that only 10% of that will be rented at 40% of the average monthly rate. So that means that out of the 10,000 proposed units to be built, approximately 370 of them will be deeply affordable housing. Are you satisfied with the contents of this report?
Ideally, we would like that to be a larger quantity.
Thank you.
Okay. No questions from the committee, so we'll break for lunch and back here at 1:30. Great. Thank you.